Hello friends. This month has been tough for the channel and I need your support. It feels like the videos aren't reaching everyone. Please like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. Thank you, and now let's begin. Lightning flickered against the treetops as I drove down the winding road towards Mark Twain National Forest. The forecast had warned of storms, but I didn't expect the sky to darken so quickly. My name is Adrian Reynolds, and in 2014 I was 35 years old and had been working as a search and rescue officer for nearly a decade. I had a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found and for venturing into places others wouldn't. The radio crackled with static as I adjusted the dial. "Adrian, you reading me?" The voice belonged to Rebecca Chen, my supervisor and the person who'd called me in on my day off. "I'm here. About 15 minutes from the coordinates," I replied, squinting through the windshield as raindrops began to splatter across it. "Good. Listen, this is the third abandoned campsite we've found this month. No signs of the campers, just their belongings left behind. Local sheriff thinks it might be bears, but..." She hesitated. "Something doesn't add up." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "What aren't you telling me, Becca?" "The rangers found blood at the second site, not much, but enough to concern us. And the way the tents were torn, it didn't look like animal damage. Too deliberate." The forest loomed ahead, ancient oaks and pines creating a wall of darkness even in daylight. I'd spent countless hours in these woods, but something about Becca's tone made the familiar landscape seem suddenly foreign. "Any witnesses? Reports of strange activity?" "Nothing concrete. Some hikers mentioned hearing odd noises at night. One guy swore he saw something tall moving between the trees, but he was also 3 beers in when the ranger interviewed him." I pulled onto a narrow dirt road, my truck jostling over exposed roots and rocks. "I'll check it out and radio back. If I find anything suspicious, I'll mark it and we can bring in a team tomorrow." "Be careful, Adrian. Take photos of everything. And don't stay after dark if you can help it." "Since when are you superstitious?" I asked, attempting to lighten the mood. "Since 3 groups of campers vanished without a trace. The line went dead, leaving me with only the rumble of thunder for company." The first raindrops fell as I parked at the trailhead. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, first aid kit, radio, GPS, knife and camera, and locked the truck. According to my map, the abandoned campsite was about a mile in, near Beaver Creek. I'd hiked this trail dozens of times but never noticed anything unusual beyond the occasional signs of wildlife. The path narrowed as I walked deeper into the forest. Oak and hickory trees stretched overhead, their canopies blocking what little light remained in the stormy sky. The air felt heavy with moisture and something else, a tension I couldn't quite define. My boots left clear impressions in the soft earth as the rain picked up, soaking through my jacket. 20 minutes later, I reached the campsite. It was exactly as Becca described, abandoned but not in a way that suggested the campers had simply packed up and left. A small fire ring contained the ash of a long-dead fire. Nearby, a water jug lay on its side, half buried in mud. Tangled rope and empty food cans were scattered around, along with a torn backpack caught on a low branch. I pulled out my camera and began documenting everything, moving methodically through the site. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead and carrying the scent of impending rain. As I circled the perimeter, I noticed something odd. Footprints, lots of them, going in every direction. Some were clearly hiking boots, others looked like sneakers, but they all showed signs of people moving quickly, erratically. "Like they were running," I murmured to myself, kneeling to examine the clearest set of prints. They belonged to someone with small feet, a woman or teenager perhaps, and showed a full sprint heading east, away from the established trails. I tried my radio, hoping to update Becca on what I'd found, but received only static in return. The storm was interfering with the signal, which meant I was effectively cut off until I returned to higher ground or the weather improved. With daylight fading and the rain picking up, I should have headed back. That would have been the protocol: mark the site, return with a team. But something about those frantically spaced footprints pulled at me. Someone had been terrified, running for their life. And if there was any chance they were still out there, injured or lost. I pulled my raincoat tighter and clicked on my flashlight. Following the footprints, I moved deeper into the woods, away from the safety of the trail. The undergrowth became thicker, thorny vines catching on my pants as I pushed forward. The rain fell harder now, but the tracks were still visible, pressed deep into the soft forest floor. Then I spotted something else. Another set of impressions interspersed with the human footprints. These were different, wider, with unusual depressions around the edges, almost like something with a strange, uneven gait was following the runner. Not a bear, definitely not a deer. The spacing was all wrong, too close together for something large. Yet the impressions were deep, suggesting considerable weight. A crack of thunder shook the forest, and I jumped despite myself. I'd been so focused on the tracks that I hadn't noticed how dark it had become or how far I'd strayed from the trail. The forest looked different here, older, more primeval. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting overhead like gnarled fingers. I checked my GPS and marked my location. According to the display, I was nearly half a mile from the campsite now, heading southeast toward a small clearing that wasn't marked on my map. Rain plastered my hair to my forehead as I debated turning back. Another flash of lightning illuminated the forest, and in that brief moment of clarity, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A strip of fabric fluttering from a broken branch ahead. Dark with what looked like dried blood, the fabric turned out to be a torn piece of raincoat similar to the one I was wearing but in bright red. I carefully removed it from the branch, noting how it had been ripped rather than cut. The edges were jagged and frayed. More concerning were the dark stains that covered nearly half of it. I took several photos before slipping it into an evidence bag. The storm showed no signs of abating as I continued following the tracks. They led me to a small stream, swollen with rainwater and rushing over smooth stones. Under normal circumstances, this would be a peaceful spot, but tonight, with the thunder rolling overhead and rain pelting my face, it felt ominous. The footprints disappeared at the water's edge. Whoever had been running had either crossed the stream or used it to cover their trail. I scanned the far bank with my flashlight but saw no signs of exit prints. Making a quick decision, I waded across, the cold water soaking through my boots and chilling my feet. On the other side, I searched for several minutes before locating a partial boot print pressed into a patch of mud. Relief washed over me. I hadn't lost the trail completely, but as I followed this new set of prints, I noticed something troubling. They were different from the ones I'd been tracking earlier. These were larger, the stride longer, suggesting a different person altogether. The rain eased slightly as I entered a dense thicket of pine trees. The ground here was carpeted with needles, making tracks harder to identify, but occasional depressions in the soft earth confirmed I was still on someone's trail. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the forest, a twisted root, a fallen log, a cluster of mushrooms gleaming with moisture. I'd been walking for nearly an hour when I stumbled across the first truly disturbing find. In a small clearing between two massive oak trees lay the carcass of a deer. But this wasn't a normal kill. The animal's body had been torn open, its ribcage splayed outward as if something had burst from within. The organs were missing, and deep gashes ran along its flanks, wounds that didn't match any predator I'd encountered in these woods. My training kicked in as I fought back the urge to retreat. I photographed the carcass from multiple angles, trying to capture the unusual nature of the wounds. The smell of decay mixed with the petrichor of rain-soaked earth made me gag, but I forced myself to examine the scene carefully. Around the deer were those strange tracks again, the ones with the irregular edges. Here they were clearer, pressed into blood-soaked soil. They resembled humanoid footprints but were too elongated, the toes spread wide and ending in what looked like sharp points. Whatever made them walked on two legs but wasn't human. I tried the radio again, desperate to report my findings, but received only electronic hissing in return. Looking at my GPS, I realized I was now over a mile from my truck, in a section of the forest rarely visited by hikers. The smart move would be to head back immediately, but the thought of someone possibly injured or trapped kept me moving forward. Beyond the clearing, the forest grew even denser. Old-growth trees blocked much of the rain, creating an eerie stillness beneath their canopy. My flashlight beam seemed weaker here, barely penetrating the gloom ahead. Every few yards I found more evidence of passage. Broken branches, disturbed ground, occasional scraps of fabric or trash. Then I found a shoe, a single hiking boot, size 10, caked in mud and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. It lay upturned in a patch of ferns, its laces still tied as if it had been violently pulled from its wearer's foot. I added it to my growing collection of evidence, my pack becoming heavier with each disturbing find. The light drizzle continued as I pressed on, my clothes soaked through and my spirits dampening with each step. What had started as a routine check of an abandoned campsite had morphed into something far more sinister. People had fled through these woods in terror, leaving behind possessions, blood, and a trail of panic. Just when I considered turning back, my flashlight beam caught something unexpected. The tattered corner of a tent through the trees ahead. Hope surged through me. Perhaps I'd found another campsite where the missing people had sought refuge. I approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings for movement. The tent was part of a larger camp, 3 shelters arranged around what had once been a fire pit. Like the first site, this one showed signs of hasty abandonment, but with one key difference. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust and pine needles, suggesting it had been empty for weeks, not days. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the forest. "Anyone here? Search and rescue." Only the patter of rain answered me. I moved through the camp, examining each tent. The first contained a sleeping bag and backpack, both mildewed from exposure to the elements. The second was empty save for a lantern with a cracked lens. The third had collapsed, its poles bent at unnatural angles as if something heavy had fallen across it. Inside the backpack, I found a wallet containing an ID for Michael Reeves, age 28, from Springfield, Missouri. There was also a journal, its pages warped from humidity but still readable. I flipped it open, angling my flashlight to see the entries. The first few pages contained typical camping notes. Hike distances, wildlife sightings, weather observations. But the tone changed dramatically in the final entry dated 6 weeks earlier. Day 5. Something is watching us from the trees. Liz thinks I'm imagining things, but I've seen movement at night, just beyond our firelight. Not an animal, too tall, too deliberate. James found weird tracks this morning, like nothing he's ever seen. We're packing up tomorrow, cutting the trip short. Can't shake the feeling we're being hunted. A cold weight settled in my stomach as I read the words. 6 weeks ago, long before the recent disappearances, whatever was happening in these woods had been going on for some time. I photographed the journal pages and was about to continue searching when a sudden crash echoed through the trees. Something large moving quickly through the underbrush headed in my direction. I doused my flashlight instinctively, plunging myself into darkness. Rain tapped gently on the fallen leaves as I crouched behind a large oak, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. Another crash, closer now, followed by a sound that raised the hair on my arms. A wet, guttural breathing that didn't belong to any forest creature I recognized. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in stark white for a split second. In that frozen moment, I caught a glimpse of something moving between distant trees. A tall, elongated shape that seemed to flow rather than walk, its proportions all wrong for either man or beast. Then darkness swallowed it again, leaving me questioning what I'd seen. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed myself against the rough bark. Years of wilderness training told me to stay still, to avoid drawing attention. But every instinct screamed to run, to put as much distance between myself and whatever lurked in the shadows. The breathing sound stopped suddenly. The forest fell into an unnatural silence, broken only by the gentle patter of rain. Somehow, this was worse than the noise. At least before, I knew where the threat was. Now it could be anywhere. Minutes passed like hours as I remained motionless, barely daring to breathe. Gradually, the normal sounds of the forest returned, the rustle of wind through leaves, the distant call of a night bird. Whatever had been there seemed to have moved on. I waited another 10 minutes before finally risking my flashlight again, keeping the beam pointed downward to minimize its visibility. With trembling hands, I gathered the journal and ID, securing them in my pack. The urge to flee was overwhelming, but I forced myself to methodically photograph the rest of the camp before backing away slowly. As I turned to leave, my light caught something I'd missed. A series of deep gouges in the trunk of a nearby pine tree. 4 parallel lines, each about an inch deep, cut through the bark at roughly 7 feet above the ground. They weren't weathered or aged. These marks were recent, the exposed wood still seeping sap. I swallowed hard, raising my flashlight to examine the surrounding trees. Each bore similar markings, always at the same height, creating a perimeter around the abandoned camp, like territory markers. Or warnings. The rain picked up again as I started back the way I'd come, moving as quietly as possible while maintaining a brisk pace. The forest felt different now, no longer a familiar workplace but a labyrinth of shadows where something unnatural watched and waited. I checked my GPS frequently, making sure I was heading toward my truck. The device showed I was about a mile away when the batteries died, the screen flickering once before going dark. I cursed quietly, switching to my compass instead. East-northeast would eventually bring me to the main trail. The distinctive crack of a branch breaking somewhere behind me quickened my steps. I no longer cared about following the original tracks or collecting evidence. My only goal was to reach the safety of my vehicle before whatever was stalking these woods decided I was worth pursuing. The forest darkened as night fully descended, intensified by the storm clouds that blocked any moonlight. My flashlight carved a narrow tunnel through the blackness, barely illuminating 3 feet ahead of me. Rain fell steadily now, drumming against the canopy and occasionally breaking through to soak my already drenched clothes. I maintained a steady pace, resisting the urge to run blindly through the treacherous terrain. A twisted ankle or broken leg would be a death sentence out here, especially with that thing somewhere in the darkness. My mind kept returning to those strange footprints, the mutilated deer, the claw marks too high for any natural predator. Another flash of lightning transformed the forest into a strobing nightmare of twisted branches and looming shadows. In that brief illumination, I spotted a familiar landmark, a lightning-struck oak that marked one of the side trails leading back to the main path. Relief washed over me. I wasn't lost after all. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with summer vegetation, but still easier to navigate than the dense forest. I moved faster now, my boots splashing through puddles as the ground grew increasingly waterlogged. Thunder rolled overhead, vibrating through my chest like a physical presence. 20 minutes of hard hiking brought me to a small wooden footbridge spanning a narrow ravine. Below, a swollen creek churned with muddy rainwater. I'd crossed this bridge dozens of times before, but tonight, halfway across, I froze in place. On the far side, illuminated by a flash of lightning, stood a figure. At first glance, it appeared to be a person, tall, thin, standing perfectly still at the trail's edge. But as lightning flashed again, I noticed details that sent ice through my veins. The proportions were wrong. Its arms hung too low, nearly to its knees, and its torso seemed unnaturally elongated. The head sat forward on a curved spine, giving it a perpetual hunched appearance. I killed my flashlight immediately, plunging myself into darkness. Rain pelted my face as I stood motionless, hoping the figure hadn't seen me. Another lightning flash revealed the bridge was empty now. The figure had vanished. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared into the darkness where it had stood. Had I imagined it? A trick of light and shadow, perhaps? Or a rain-soaked tree trunk transformed by my anxious mind? I waited several minutes before cautiously proceeding, flashlight still off, using the intermittent lightning to guide my way. The far side of the bridge revealed nothing, no tracks, no signs of the figure. I swept my gaze across the surrounding forest, seeing only trees swaying in the wind. Clicking my flashlight back on, I moved quickly down the trail, constantly looking over my shoulder. The path narrowed as it wound through a dense stand of pines, the needles underfoot muffling my footsteps. The relative quiet made every snapping twig and rustling branch stand out in stark relief. I had just rounded a bend when my light caught something that stopped me cold. A splash of color against the forest floor. A backpack, torn open, its contents spilled across the trail. Clothing, a water bottle, energy bars, and a smashed cell phone lay scattered in the mud. Kneeling beside the pack, I noticed dark stains soaking the fabric. Blood relatively fresh. Nearby lay a camera, its lens cracked but the body intact. I picked it up, checking if it still functioned. The power button lit the display, revealing the last images taken before it was dropped. The first few photos showed typical camping scenes. Smiling people, forest views, a sunset over distant hills. The subjects were a young couple mid-20s with matching hiking gear and enthusiastic expressions. The final image, however, made my chest tighten. Taken at night, it showed only blurred darkness except for what looked like a tall, emaciated figure at the frame's edge, caught in motion as it approached the photographer. I slipped the camera into my pack, standing quickly as a sense of being watched crawled up my spine. The rain had slackened to a light drizzle, but the air felt heavier somehow, charged with an electric tension that had nothing to do with the storm. "Hello?" I called out, against my better judgment. "Is anyone there?" "Search and rescue," my voice echoed through the trees, met only by the soft patter of raindrops. I turned slowly, scanning the surrounding forest with my flashlight. The beam caught something reflective about 30 yards off the trail. A pair of eyes watching me from between two massive tree trunks. Not human eyes, they were set too far apart, and instead of reflecting my light with the typical red or yellow eyeshine of forest animals, they gleamed with a dull, oily iridescence, like the surface of a polluted pond. I backed away slowly, keeping my light trained on those unblinking eyes. They remained fixed in place, neither advancing nor retreating. Then, without warning, they were gone. not closing or moving away, but simply vanishing as if they'd never been there at all. My retreat became less measured, turning into a barely controlled jog as I navigated the slippery trail. The weight of my pack bounced against my back, filled with evidence of something I couldn't explain, wouldn't want to explain to anyone who hadn't seen it for themselves. The trail widened as it joined the main path, bringing me within half a mile of my truck. I allowed myself a moment of hope. Whatever was out there hadn't pursued me openly. Perhaps I could make it back without further incident. That hope shattered with the sound of movement in the underbrush to my right. Quick, purposeful motion parallel to my path. Something was pacing me, matching my speed while staying just out of sight. I increased my pace, and the rustling kept time, never falling behind. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the forest. In that split second, I caught a glimpse of my pursuer, a tall, lanky form moving with unnatural fluidity between the trees. Its skin appeared mottled and rough, like tree bark or weathered leather, and its limbs bent at odd angles with each step. Fear shot through me like electricity. I abandoned all pretense of caution and broke into a full sprint, careening down the muddy trail with reckless abandon. Branches whipped my face, and twice I nearly fell, my boots sliding on slick leaves and exposed roots. The thing kept pace, crashing through the forest beside me, no longer attempting stealth. I heard its labored breathing, a wet, rattling sound that reminded me of the death gasps I'd witnessed in my worst search and rescue experiences. The trail curved sharply, and I skidded around the bend, nearly colliding with a fallen tree blocking the path. I vaulted over it, landing awkwardly and feeling a sharp pain shoot through my ankle. Not broken, but definitely strained. I pushed through the pain, limping forward as quickly as possible. Behind me, I heard the creature leap the obstacle with ease, landing with a heavy thud that shook the ground. It was gaining on me now, my injured ankle slowing me just enough to give it an advantage. Through the trees ahead, I spotted the glint of metal. My truck, parked where I'd left it at the trailhead. Salvation was less than 100 yards away. I forced my burning legs to move faster, ignoring the stabbing pain with each step. 70 yards. 60. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, punctuated by that horrible wet breathing. A gnarled root caught my toe, sending me sprawling face first into the mud. My flashlight flew from my hand, its beam spinning crazily before landing pointed into the trees. My pack cushioned some of the fall, but pain still radiated from my palms and knees where they'd impacted the ground. I scrambled to my feet, not daring to look back, leaving the flashlight where it had fallen. The truck was close enough now that I could see it clearly in the sporadic lightning flashes, a rectangular sanctuary in the wilderness, 30 yards. 20. The creature's breathing was right behind me now, close enough that I imagined I could feel its hot exhalations on my neck. I reached the edge of the clearing and sprinted for my vehicle, keys already in hand. With trembling fingers, I jammed the key into the lock and wrenched the door open, throwing myself inside. The door slammed shut behind me just as something heavy collided with the side of the truck, rocking it on its suspension. My hands shook violently as I fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I immediately locked all doors, frantically checking each window for signs of my pursuer. A flash of lightning revealed nothing but empty forest and rain-slicked ground. I threw the truck into reverse, backing away from the trailhead before shifting into drive and accelerating down the forest road. In my rearview mirror, a final lightning bolt illuminated a tall, hunched silhouette standing at the forest's edge, watching as I fled. I drove recklessly fast down the winding forest road, tires skidding on the wet pavement as I took corners too sharply. Adrenaline pumped through my system, keeping the pain in my ankle at bay and my senses hyper-alert. Every shadow seemed to move. Every tree branch scraping against the truck made me flinch. When I reached the main highway, I pulled over long enough to try my radio again. This time, I got through. "Becca, do you copy? This is Adrian." Static crackled. Then her voice came through, concerned and slightly distorted. "Adrian, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "Something's out there, Becca. Something." I paused, suddenly aware of how insane I would sound if I told her everything I'd seen. "I found evidence of violence, blood, torn clothing, abandoned equipment, and tracks I can't identify." "Are you hurt?" Her voice sharpened with worry. "Just a twisted ankle. But I'm bringing back evidence. A journal, photos, a camera that might have captured." I trailed off again. "Captured what, Adrian?" I swallowed hard. "I need to show you. I'm heading to the station now. I'll meet you there. Drive carefully. The storm's getting worse." She was right. The rain had intensified, sheets of water slamming against my windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. Visibility was down to mere feet, forcing me to crawl along at 20 miles per hour. The 15-minute drive to the ranger station stretched to nearly 40 as I navigated the treacherous conditions. Lightning continued to flash overhead, briefly illuminating the road ahead before plunging it back into darkness. During one such flash, I spotted something that made my stomach lurch. A figure standing motionless on the shoulder, its elongated form unmistakable even in that brief glimpse. I blinked, and it was gone. A hallucination surely, born of fear and exhaustion. It couldn't have followed me this far, this fast. Not unless it knew these woods far better than any human could. The lights of the ranger station appeared through the downpour, a welcome sight after the horrors of the forest. I parked haphazardly near the entrance and limped inside, my soaked clothes leaving puddles on the linoleum floor. Becca met me in the lobby, her face tight with concern. At 45, she'd been running search and rescue operations in Mark Twain for over 20 years, and had seen just about everything the forest could throw at a person. Or so we thought. "You look like hell," she said bluntly, helping me to a chair in her office. "What happened out there?" I dropped my mud-covered pack on her desk and began pulling out the evidence I'd collected: the blood-stained fabric, the hiking boot, the journal, the damaged camera. As I laid each item before her, I recounted my experience, starting with the abandoned campsite and ending with my frantic flight to the truck. I held back nothing, not even the most unbelievable details: the creature's impossible proportions, its inhuman speed, the way it seemed to vanish and reappear at will. Throughout my account, Becca's expression remained neutral, her years of training keeping any skepticism from showing on her face. When I finished, she picked up the camera, examining the final image with narrowed eyes. "And you're certain this wasn't a bear? Maybe standing on its hind legs? Bears don't leave tracks like the ones I saw. They don't mark trees 7 feet off the ground. And they don't pursue prey the way this thing chased me." She nodded slowly, setting the camera down. "I've known you 8 years, Adrian. You're not the type to exaggerate or imagine things." She rubbed her temples, considering. "We need to bring in the sheriff, show him this evidence. And I want to get a team together to go back there tomorrow, in daylight." "You believe me then?" "I believe you saw something." "What exactly? I'm not sure yet." She hesitated. "There have been stories about that section of the forest. Old stories from before my time. Hikers going missing, strange sounds at night. Most rangers dismiss it as campfire tales. But what? My predecessor used to say some parts of these woods were better left alone. That there were things out there older than the trees themselves." She shook her head. "I never put much stock in it until the disappearances started up again." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. "Again? This has happened before?" "In the 70s. And before that, in the 30s. Clusters of disappearances over a few months. Then nothing for decades. Always in the same general area." The implications settled over me like a physical weight. Whatever was stalking the forest wasn't new. It had been there for generations, perhaps centuries, preying on those who ventured too deep into its territory. Becca stood abruptly. "You need dry clothes and medical attention for that ankle. Then I want you to write up everything you saw, every detail, no matter how small or strange it seems." I nodded, grateful for her pragmatic approach. As she helped me to the first aid room, a flash of movement outside the window caught my eye. I turned quickly but saw only rain-soaked darkness and the vague outline of trees swaying in the wind. Yet the sense of being watched remained, a persistent itch between my shoulder blades that wouldn't subside. While a paramedic wrapped my ankle, Becca made calls, assembling a team for the morning expedition. I heard fragments of her conversations, careful descriptions of evidence found, requests for additional personnel, specific equipment needed for the search. Not once did she mention my description of the creature. That part, I realized, she was keeping between us until we had more concrete proof. By midnight I had changed into dry clothes and completed my report, documenting every moment of my experience in clinical detail. Reading it back, the encounter seemed simultaneously more real and more impossible than it had in the moment. The rational part of my mind still sought explanations: a bear with mange, an unusually tall human with twisted intentions, a combination of bad weather and worse luck creating phantoms where none existed. But deeper down, I knew what I had seen was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in our understanding of the natural world. Becca arranged for me to sleep in one of the station's bunk rooms, used by rangers during extended shifts. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that elongated silhouette watching me from the forest's edge, its body bent at impossible angles, its movements too fluid for something of its size. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on rest and limped to the window, staring out at the storm-lashed forest beyond the station's perimeter fence. The rain had finally begun to taper off, revealing patches of night sky between the clouds. Moonlight filtered down, casting the trees in silver and shadow. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something that made my heart stutter. A tall figure standing just beyond the fence line, partially obscured by a massive oak tree. It remained perfectly still, its outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest. But I knew it was there, watching, waiting. I blinked, and it shifted position, now standing closer to the fence, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as if studying the building. Another blink, and it had moved again, its impossible speed defying physics. I stumbled back from the window, my injured ankle protesting as I put weight on it. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the small room with fluorescent brightness. Returning to the window, I saw nothing but empty forest. No figure, no movement beyond the gentle sway of branches in the dying wind. Had it been there at all? Or was my mind conjuring phantoms from trauma and exhaustion? I didn't return to bed. Instead, I sat in a chair facing the door, my back to the wall, watching shadows pass beneath the gap as night staff moved through the hallway. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. Morning arrived with clear skies and birdsong, the storm having passed during the night. The forest beyond the station looked peaceful, benign, nothing like the nightmare landscape I'd fled hours earlier. Becca found me in the cafeteria, staring into a cup of untouched coffee. The dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd slept as poorly as I had. Teams assembled, she said without preamble. Sheriff sending 2 deputies, and we've got 4 rangers plus a wildlife expert from the university. We head out in 30 minutes. I nodded, relief washing over me. In daylight, with a well-armed team, we could find answers, maybe even track the creature to its lair. I want you to stay here, she added, crushing my momentary optimism. What? No, I need to go. I know what we're looking for, where I found everything. You've marked all the locations on the map, and your ankle needs rest. Besides, she lowered her voice, if this thing is what you say it is, you've already encountered it once. It might recognize you, target you specifically. I can't risk that. Her logic was sound, but frustration still bubbled inside me. At least let me monitor radio communications from here. If something goes wrong, I can coordinate additional resources. Becca agreed to this compromise, and I spent the next hour helping the team prepare, transferring GPS coordinates, describing landmarks, explaining the strange tracks and territorial markings they should look for. The wildlife expert, Dr. Ramona Moss, listened with particular interest to my description of the creature. Rather than dismissing my account, she asked detailed questions about its movements, posture, and apparent physical characteristics. There are documented cases of unknown species existing in isolated pockets, she explained when I expressed surprise at her open-mindedness. The coelacanth was thought extinct for millions of years until one turned up in a fishing net. Nature has many secrets she hasn't shared with science yet. Her words were meant to be reassuring, I think, but they only deepened my unease. If this thing was some undiscovered species, it had evolved to be a perfect predator, one that understood human behavior well enough to stalk and ambush us with terrifying efficiency. At 9:30 a.m., the team departed in 3 vehicles, loaded with equipment for both search and rescue and wildlife management. I watched them go from the station's front steps, fighting the nagging feeling that I was sending them into danger they couldn't possibly comprehend. Becca had set up a communications center in her office, where I could monitor the team's progress via radio and GPS tracking. For the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. They reached the trailhead, located the initial campsite, and began following the same path I had taken the previous day. Found the torn fabric exactly where you marked it. Becca's voice crackled over the radio. And these tracks? They're like nothing I've ever seen. Ramona's taking casts. Relief flooded through me. Physical evidence meant I hadn't imagined it all, that something real had stalked me through those woods. The team continued to the abandoned camp I'd discovered, reporting the claw marks on trees, the scattered possessions, the journal exactly as I'd described them. With each confirmation, my credibility strengthened, but so did my concern for their safety. By noon, they had reached the location where I'd encountered the deer carcass. Remains are still here, Becca reported, but they've been disturbed further. More of the flesh is gone, and there are fresh tracks around the site. A chill ran down my spine. Fresh tracks? From last night? Ramona thinks so. After the rain stopped, something returned to feed. The implication was clear. The creature was still active in the area, still hunting. Be careful, I warned unnecessarily. That thing moves fast, and it can cover a lot of ground quickly. We're keeping tight formation, weapons ready, she assured me. Heading toward the ravine where you spotted it on the bridge next. I tracked their progress on the GPS display, watching the cluster of dots move steadily through the forest. They reached the bridge without incident, finding nothing unusual beyond more of those distinctive tracks preserved in the mud. The next hour passed uneventfully as the team methodically searched the area where I'd found the torn backpack and fallen camera. They recovered additional evidence, a broken walking stick, a shredded tent segment, a single shoe that matched the one I'd found. We're going to push a bit further, Becca radioed. There's a stream about half a mile ahead that creates a natural boundary. If our target is territorial, that might mark the edge of its range. I wanted to protest, to tell them they'd gone far enough, but I bit my tongue. They were professionals, well-armed and experienced. And daylight made the forest less threatening, the shadows less concealing. The team moved forward, their GPS markers showing steady progress toward the stream. Then, abruptly, one of the dots separated from the group, moving at an unusual angle. Becca, you've got someone breaking formation, I radioed quickly. Negative, she replied after a moment. All personnel accounted for and together. I stared at the screen, confused. I'm showing a marker moving northeast, away from your position. A pause. That's impossible. Let me check. I watched as the rogue dot continued to move, its pace increasing as it headed deeper into the forest. Then, one by one, the other dots began to drift in different directions, creating a scattered pattern across the GPS display. Becca, what's happening? Your team is dispersing. Static answered me, interspersed with fragments of voices. Interference. Can't explain. Markers malfunctioning. Cold dread pooled in my stomach as I realized what was happening. The GPS system was being compromised somehow, the signals scattered or redirected to show movement that wasn't occurring. Becca, your GPS is unreliable. I repeat, GPS tracking is compromised. Establish visual contact with all team members immediately. More static, then her voice came through clearly. Adrian, something's wrong. The equipment is malfunctioning. Compasses are spinning, GPS is scrambled. Even the radios are. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched electronic whine that made me rip the headset from my ears. When I cautiously replaced it, there was nothing but dead air. I tried every channel, calling for Becca, for any team member who could respond. Nothing. The GPS display now showed the dots randomly scattered across miles of forest, some moving at impossible speeds, others completely stationary. Panic rose in my throat as I grabbed my phone, dialing Becca's cell number. It rang once before going to voicemail, suggesting no signal in her location. I tried the sheriff's office next, explaining the situation in rushed, fragmented sentences. They promised to send additional personnel, but it would take time to mobilize. Time the team might not have if my fears were justified. I made a decision then, one born of desperation and a deep certainty that waiting would only lead to more lives lost. My ankle still throbbed, but the swelling had reduced enough for me to walk. I changed into fresh ranger gear, packed emergency supplies, and grabbed a high-powered rifle from the station's armory. No one tried to stop me as I signed out a vehicle and headed back toward the forest. They had heard enough of my story, seen enough of the evidence to understand the urgency, or perhaps they simply recognized the determination in my eyes, the look of someone who wouldn't be dissuaded no matter what regulations were cited. As I drove back toward Mark Twain National Forest, the clear blue sky began to darken once more. Not with storm clouds this time, but with the approach of evening. I was racing against the setting sun, knowing that once darkness fell, the advantage would shift decisively to whatever hunted in those ancient woods, the same creature that was now, I feared, hunting my friends and colleagues. I reached the trailhead just as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, casting long shadows across the parking area. The team's vehicles sat empty, their equipment neatly stowed inside, a stark contrast to the chaos I imagined was unfolding deeper in the forest. My ankle protested as I geared up, strapping on a tactical vest loaded with flares, extra ammunition, first aid supplies, and emergency rations. I checked the rifle, ensured my sidearm was secure in its holster, and activated a personal locator beacon, a last resort if things went catastrophically wrong. The trail stretched before me, disappearing into the growing twilight. I clicked on my high-powered flashlight and started forward, moving as quickly as my injury allowed. Birds fell silent as darkness crept through the underbrush, replaced by the chorus of insects and the occasional hooting of an owl. I followed the team's tracks easily at first, multiple boot prints pressed into the soft earth, along with occasional equipment drag marks. They had moved in formation, just as Becca had reported. maintaining the discipline of experienced professionals. Half a mile in, I reached the first campsite where everything had begun yesterday. The team had disturbed it further during their investigation, colored flags marking points of interest and evidence collection. I continued past it, my pace quickening as the last of the daylight faded from the sky. The air felt different tonight, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. The forest seemed to press in around me, the spaces between trees darker than they should be, as if the darkness had substance rather than absence. I reached the location of the deer carcass, now removed by the team for further study. All that remained was a dark stain on the ground and the lingering smell of decay. My flashlight beam caught something new, however. Fresh tracks leading away from the site, pressed into the soil after the team had departed. Not human tracks. Those same elongated, oddly proportioned footprints I'd seen yesterday, following the team's trail with apparent purpose. Cold certainty settled in my gut. The creature was tracking them, perhaps had been from the moment they entered its territory. The team's last transmission had come from near the stream, still a mile ahead. I needed to move faster. I broke into a jog, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ankle. The beam of my flashlight bounced erratically, creating disorienting shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees casting them. Twice I thought I saw movement in my periphery, but when I turned, found nothing but darkened forest. The bridge over the ravine appeared ahead, its wooden planks gleaming dully in my light. I slowed, approaching cautiously, remembering my encounter there the previous night. The structure seemed intact, no signs of struggle or violence. Halfway across, I paused to catch my breath. The creek below had subsided since the storm, now barely a trickle over smooth stones. In the silence, I heard something that made me freeze, a faint rhythmic tapping from somewhere in the darkness ahead. I doused my flashlight, plunging myself into near total darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, revealing the silhouettes of trees against the slightly lighter sky. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone or something striking wood against wood. Moving silently now, I crept forward, using the ambient light to navigate. The sound grew louder as I approached, guiding me off the main trail and into a dense thicket of young pines. Through the branches, I caught a glimpse of flickering light, not electric, but the warm glow of fire. Hope surged through me. The team must have established a camp, perhaps when their equipment failed. I moved faster, pushing through the undergrowth until I reached the edge of a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me cold. A campfire burned in the center of the clearing, but it wasn't the team gathered around it. 3 figures sat motionless, their backs to me, facing the flames. Their proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, their spines curved in impossible ways. They wore no clothes, their skin a mottled texture that reminded me of tree bark or weathered leather. Between them, laid out on the ground like offerings, were items I recognized: a ranger's hat, a backpack, a jacket that looked like Becca's. The tapping sound came from one of the creatures, its elongated fingers striking a radio against a rock in rhythmic sequence. I eased backward, fighting the urge to flee immediately. I needed to know if the team was alive, if there was anyone to rescue. From my new position, I could see more of the clearing, including what appeared to be crude shelters constructed from branches and animal hides at its far edge. Movement caught my eye, something emerging from one of these shelters. Another creature, similar to the others but larger, dragging what I initially thought was a deer carcass. With horrified recognition, I realized it was a person, unconscious or dead, being pulled by their arms. The larger creature deposited its burden near the fire, and in the flickering light, I caught a glimpse of a uniform, one of the deputies who had accompanied the team. He wasn't moving, but I couldn't tell if he was breathing. My hand tightened on the rifle as I assessed the situation. 4 creatures that I could see, possibly more in the shelters. At least one human captive, status unknown. No sign of the others, which could mean they'd escaped or had already met a worse fate. I needed to act, but charging in would be suicide. These things had taken down an entire team of armed professionals. My only advantage was surprise, and even that might not be enough. A plan formed in my mind. Risky, desperate, but the only option I could see. I retreated further into the woods, circling the clearing until I reached the opposite side, closer to the shelters. From this angle, I could make out more details of the creatures gathered around the fire. Their faces were the most disturbing part, almost human in structure but stretched and distorted, with sunken eye sockets and mouths that seemed too wide for their narrow heads. They communicated with each other through a series of clicks and low hums that bore no resemblance to human speech. I removed 2 flares from my vest, along with my lighter and a handful of emergency fire starters, chemical packets designed to ignite quickly and burn hot. If these things lived in the forest, perhaps they feared its most destructive element. Selecting a patch of dry underbrush about 50 yards from the clearing, I arranged the fire starters and surrounded them with dead leaves and small branches. It wouldn't create a forest fire. The ground was still too damp from yesterday's rain, but it would create a diversion. I struck the lighter, igniting the chemical packets. They flared immediately, setting the surrounding tinder ablaze. I added larger sticks, building the fire quickly before retreating. Once at a safe distance, I ignited the first flare and threw it high over the trees, where it burst into brilliant red light, illuminating the forest like a miniature sun. The reaction from the clearing was immediate. Harsh, guttural cries and the sound of rapid movement. I circled back toward my diversion fire, which had grown considerably, flames now reaching toward the lower branches of nearby trees. I ignited the second flare and threw it directly into the growing blaze, causing a shower of sparks and an intense flare of light. Then I moved quickly toward the clearing, rifle ready. The creatures had scattered, 3 of them loping toward the diversion on those unnaturally long limbs. The fourth, the largest one, remained near the fire, crouched protectively over the fallen deputy. I took aim and fired, the rifle's report shattering the night's silence. The creature jerked as the bullet struck its shoulder, letting out a high-pitched scream that sounded nothing like any animal I'd ever heard. It spun toward me, revealing pupilless eyes that reflected the firelight like oil slicks. I fired again, aiming for its chest. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it charged, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. I emptied the magazine, each impact slowing it but somehow not stopping its advance. At the last moment, I drew my sidearm and fired point-blank into its face as it reached for me. The creature finally collapsed, its body convulsing briefly before going still. The stench that rose from it was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting vegetation, stagnant water, and something else, something chemical and alien. I had no time to examine it. The other creatures would return soon, drawn by the gunfire and their fallen companion. I rushed to the deputy, finding him unconscious but alive, his pulse weak but steady. "Adams," I shook him gently. "Deputy Adams, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. A quick examination revealed no obvious injuries beyond a large contusion on his temple. They had taken him alive, for reasons I didn't want to contemplate. "I'm getting you out of here," I muttered, hoisting him into a fireman's carry despite my protesting ankle. His weight nearly buckled my injured leg, but adrenaline kept me upright. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a familiar shape half buried beneath debris near one of the shelters. Becca's distinctive red backpack, still partially packed with equipment. I staggered toward it, shifting Adam's weight to maintain balance. Inside the pack I found her journal, her personal locator beacon, and a folded map with handwritten notes. I stuffed these into my vest before noticing something else, a narrow opening behind the shelter, descending into darkness like the entrance to a burrow or cave. From that opening came sounds, faint moans that might be human, mixed with those same clicking communications I'd heard from the creatures. More captives, possibly the rest of the team, held somewhere beneath the forest floor. Agonizing indecision froze me in place. I couldn't leave potential survivors behind, but Adams needed immediate medical attention, and I couldn't fight those things while carrying him. The decision was made for me as distant howls signaled the return of the other creatures. They had discovered their fallen companion or the diversion, possibly both. I had minutes at most before they descended on the clearing. "I'll come back," I promised quietly to whoever might be trapped below, before turning and carrying Adams into the forest as quickly as my burdened body would allow. The journey back was a nightmare of exhaustion, pain, and constant fear. Every snapping twig became a pursuing creature, every shadow a potential ambush. I avoided the trails, instead plotting a direct course through the wilderness toward the road, using the stars for navigation now that the sky had cleared. Adams stirred occasionally but never fully regained consciousness. His breathing remained steady, which I took as a positive sign. Whatever these creatures were, they seemed to want their captives alive, at least initially. After what felt like hours of tortuous progress, I glimpsed the reflective markers at the forest's edge that indicated the main road. My strength was failing, my ankle a throbbing mass of pain, but the sight gave me a final surge of energy. I broke through the tree line just as headlights appeared around a bend, the sheriff's backup team finally arriving. I collapsed to my knees, still clutching Adams, as vehicles screeched to a halt and uniformed officers poured out, weapons drawn. "There are more," I gasped as they reached us. Still in there, underground. The next hours passed in a blur of medical attention, debriefing, and mounting rescue operations. I described the clearing, the shelters, the underground entrance in as much detail as I could remember. Maps were consulted, strategies formed, additional resources called in from neighboring counties. By dawn, a full-scale operation was underway, not just search and rescue, but tactical teams equipped for hostage recovery. I watched from a command vehicle, my ankle properly bandaged, as dozens of armed personnel disappeared into the forest that had nearly claimed my life. They found the clearing exactly where I'd described it, the body of the creature I'd killed still lying where it had fallen. Scientific teams descended on it immediately, their initial reports suggesting nothing even close to a known species, a biological impossibility that somehow existed anyway. The underground entrance led to a network of tunnels extending deep beneath the forest floor, some apparently natural, others clearly excavated. Within these passages they found 4 survivors from our team, including Becca, all unconscious but alive, showing similar contusions to Adam's. They also found human remains. Dozens of them, in various states of decay, some recent, others reduced to bones that carbon dating would later reveal to be decades or even centuries old. The creatures had been hunting in these woods for generations, taking their prey below ground for purposes we still don't fully understand. The last of the creatures was cornered in the deepest part of the tunnel network, 7 in total, all similar to the one I'd encountered, all displaying that same impossible biology that defied classification. They fought with surprising intelligence and coordination but were ultimately overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. In the aftermath, the official explanation given to the public was that a previously undocumented predator species had been discovered and neutralized. The more disturbing details, the human-like aspects of the creatures, their apparent intelligence, the centuries of predation, were classified and contained within agencies equipped to study such anomalies. Adams recovered fully, though like the others rescued from the tunnels, he retained no memory of his capture or captivity. The gap in their recollections was deemed a blessing by the psychologists who evaluated them. I wasn't so fortunate. My memories remained intact, vivid, and haunting. The images of those elongated figures moving through the trees, their oil-slick eyes reflecting firelight, their bodies bent at impossible angles, these things visited me nightly for months afterward. Eventually, I transferred to another district, another forest. The official reason was my injured ankle, which never fully healed, leaving me with a permanent limp that ended my field career. The truth was simpler. I couldn't look at those trees without seeing shadows moving between them, couldn't hear the wind without catching hints of that clicking communication. 5 years have passed since that night in Mark Twain National Forest. I work a desk job now, coordinating search and rescue operations rather than participating in them. My experience has made me particularly attentive to certain patterns in missing persons reports, clusters of disappearances in remote areas, abandoned equipment with no signs of the owners, unusual tracks or markings that field agents can't identify. Most turn out to be ordinary, explicable tragedies, hikers who wandered off trails, campers who underestimated the weather, predators of the 4-legged variety claiming occasional victims. But sometimes, rarely, I see something in the reports that raises the hair on my neck, details that echo my experience in those dark woods. When that happens, I make calls to certain agencies, people who were there that night or who have been briefed on what we found. Because while we eliminated the creatures from Mark Twain Forest, none of us believed they were unique or isolated. The tunnels extended for miles, with branches that collapsed or were blocked before they could be fully explored. The forest is vast, ancient, and full of shadows. What we encountered may have been just one colony, one nest of something that has existed alongside humanity for centuries, watching us from the darkness between trees. I still hike occasionally, always in daylight, always in well-traveled areas. But I never venture deep into the woods anymore. And when night falls, I make sure I'm safely indoors, away from the ancient spaces where things with oil-slick eyes and bark-like skin might move silently between trees, watching for those who stray too far from the trail. Because the echoes of frantic screams still ring in my ears. The memory of that clearing has haunted me every time I close my eyes. One moment, everything was calm, just the hum of the forest and my own footsteps. The next, I was face to face with something savage, its presence revealed by the carnage it left behind. There was no denying that I'd uncovered a horrifying secret in Mark Twain National Forest. And sometimes in my darkest moments I fear it's only a matter of time before someone else does too. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel was the only thing breaking the stillness of the night. I hadn't slept properly in days, maybe weeks. I'd lost track. It was the kind of job that wore you down without you even noticing. Sleep wasn't the problem. The things I'd seen were. Things nobody in their right mind should ever have to face, let alone admit to. I'm the deputy sheriff of Pine Ridge County, Wyoming. It's 2004, and this is about as middle of nowhere as you can get. The kind of place where people disappear and nobody asks questions because nobody's there to hear them, and if there were, well, they wouldn't bother asking anyway. I signed up as a deputy 3 years ago because the big city chewed me up and spat me out. Too much noise, too many people. This place, though, it was quiet, simple, cows, fences, and tumbleweeds as far as the eye could see. Seemed perfect, except when it wasn't. You see, Pine Ridge had its secrets. People would come in asking about a lost hiker or a missing hunter. The official response? They got lost in the woods or must have had an accident. But I knew better. We all did. Sheriff Reeves had been here for 30 years. A tall, leathery man with eyes that had seen too much. He never talked about the strange occurrences that plagued our county, but you could see it in the way he'd stare off into the distance, particularly when looking toward the eastern forest. Just focus on keeping the peace, he told me my first day. The rest will sort itself out. I didn't understand what he meant then. Now I do. The stories were passed around over cheap whiskey, always late at night when nobody wanted to admit they were spooked. Stories of things that moved too fast, too quiet for any normal animal. Old-timers like Vernon at the gas station would clam up mid-sentence when you'd ask directly. Tourist hikers reported strange sounds, like metal scraping against bone. Hunters would come back with less game than usual, muttering about feeling watched. It was October 17th, a Tuesday. The air had turned bitter cold practically overnight. Wyoming doesn't ease you into winter, it throws you head first into it. I remember checking the temperature gauge on my cruiser, 28 degrees. My breath clouded in front of my face as I made my rounds through the silent streets of our town center, if you could call it that. One diner, a general store, a bar, and a gas station. The bank only opened 3 days a week. I was sitting in my cruiser sipping the worst gas station coffee Wyoming had to offer when dispatch crackled over the radio. "Deputy, we got a call from the Jenkins farm. Couple of their livestock went missing. Can you check it out?" I sighed and tossed the coffee out the window. "Yeah, sure, heading that way." The Jenkins farm was about 20 minutes out, sitting on the edge of a forest that everyone in town avoided like the plague. No one ever said why, but you could feel it, a weird energy that made the hair on your arm stand up. The locals called it Devil's Wood. Some people said it was cursed. I wasn't superstitious, but I wasn't about to make that forest my regular hiking spot either. As I drove, the radio station faded to static. Normal for these parts. The mountains blocked most signals, but tonight the static sounded different, almost like it was forming words. I switched it off, preferring the silence. The road to the Jenkins place was a winding dirt path that cut through empty fields. No streetlights out here, just my headlights cutting through an absolute darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The kind of darkness that feels like it has weight, substance, presence. The full moon cast long shadows across the fields, making ordinary fence posts look like figures standing at attention. An owl swooped across my path, and I nearly swerved off the road. Jumpy. I'd been jumpy for weeks now, ever since I'd found those hikers in the North Pass. Their tent had been shredded, belongings scattered. We never found the bodies. As I pulled up to the Jenkins place, I could see Old Man Jenkins waiting by the barn, shotgun slung over his shoulder. "Deputy," he greeted me, the lines on his face deep with worry. "You're going to want to see this." Roy Jenkins was pushing 70, but he worked his land like a man half his age. His wife had died 10 years back, and his children had all moved away to cities with more promise than Pine Ridge could offer. He was alone out here, which made what I was about to see all the more disturbing. He led me to the back of the barn, where 3 cows lay in the grass, each torn to shreds in a way that no wolf or coyote could have done. It wasn't just that they were dead, it was the way they were killed. The rib cages were crushed like something massive had stepped on them, but there were no tracks. Nothing but claw marks so deep they could have been made by a backhoe. I crouched down, feeling cold sweat drip down the back of my neck. "What the hell happened here, Jenkins?" He spat on the ground. "I ain't seen nothing, but I heard it. Big, fast, too fast. Took them down like they were toys." I examined the carcasses more closely. The wounds were precise in a way that seemed almost methodical. Not the random savagery of a predator, but something almost intentional. And the blood. There wasn't enough of it. These animals had been drained. "When did this happen?" "Last night, round midnight." Heard the commotion, grabbed my shotgun, but by the time I got out here, whatever did it was gone. He paused, looking toward the forest. Came from there, always does. I could feel that familiar churn in my gut. The one that told me I should walk away. But curiosity killed the cat, right? I'll check it out, I said, standing up. I'll take a look in the woods. Jenkins shook his head. You don't want to do that, deputy. Ain't no good comes from going in there. I'll be fine, I lied. I radioed back to dispatch, letting them know I'd be out of the cruiser for a bit and headed toward the tree line, flashlight in hand. The woods loomed ahead, a black wall of tangled branches and ancient oaks that looked like they'd swallowed the sunlight whole. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I kept walking. A stupid cop trying to prove something to himself, I guess. Behind me I heard Jenkins call out, "Don't go too deep, and whatever you do, if you hear it, don't run. It likes it when they run." The tree line stood like a barrier between two worlds. On one side, the relative safety of the Jenkins farm with its weathered buildings and familiar sounds. On the other, Devil's Wood, a place that seemed to exist in defiance of everything rational and known. I paused at the edge, looking back at Jenkins, who stood watching me, his shotgun now raised slightly as if ready. The old man's face was a mask of concern. He knew something. They all did. But no one ever said it outright. That's how Pine Ridge worked. The truth existed in the spaces between words, in the things left unsaid. I'll check the perimeter, I called back, trying to sound professional. Won't be long. Jenkins nodded but didn't move. He would wait. My flashlight beam seemed too weak against the oppressive darkness of the woods. The trees here were old, gnarled things with bark like dried skin and branches that reached like arthritic fingers toward a sky they could never touch. The forest floor was covered in a thick carpet of leaves and moss that muffled my footsteps. The smell hit me first. A deep, earthy scent mixed with something rotten. Not the usual forest decay, but something sharper, more metallic. Like old blood, I followed what appeared to be a game trail, keeping the farm in sight behind me. The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across my path. The temperature seemed to drop with each step I took deeper into the trees. My breath fogged in front of me, now visible even in the beam of my flashlight. About 20 yards in, I found the first tracks, not animal prints, at least not from any animal I'd ever seen. They were deep impressions in the soft earth, roughly circular but with strange protrusions, like five-toed feet ending in hooks rather than claws. And they were big, each print the size of a dinner plate. Whatever made these walks on two legs, I thought. The realization sent a jolt of fear through me. I knelt to examine them more closely. The edges were crisp, fresh. Whatever made these had passed through recently. I took out my phone to snap a picture, but the battery was suddenly dead. Despite having been fully charged back at the station, technology often failed around Devil's Wood. Another one of those things everyone knew but no one discussed. I stood and continued following the trail, against my better judgment. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward an area locals called the Hollow, a natural depression in the land where nothing grew, not even weeds. I'd heard stories about the Hollow since my first week on the job. Strange lights, unexplained sounds, animals found mutilated. About 10 minutes in, the air got thick, almost too heavy to breathe. My flashlight cut through the dark, but barely. That's when I heard it, branches snapping somewhere to my left. My hand dropped to my gun, but I kept walking. Could have been a deer, I told myself. Could have been anything, but it wasn't. I knew that the moment I saw it, the thing moved between the trees, a blur of fur and muscle, too fast for my eyes to make sense of. But it wasn't just fast, it was massive, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, and its limbs moved in a way that made my skin crawl, like it wasn't put together right. I stood frozen, my hand still on my gun, but I knew shooting it wouldn't help. I caught only glimpses. A flash of something that might have been an eye reflecting my flashlight beam, but too high up for any normal animal. A shadow that seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways. The sound of something heavy dragging through the underbrush, and then silence. Complete and absolute. Even the wind stopped. The forest held its breath, and so did I. A loud crash came from behind me, and I spun around, heart pounding in my throat. The trees groaned under the weight of something. Something alive but barely visible, a shape, larger than life, darted between the branches, and before I could even raise my weapon, it was on me. I fired blindly into the darkness, praying that I hit something, but the shots just echoed uselessly through the trees. My back slammed against the ground, the wind knocked out of me, and all I could see were these massive claws slashing through the air. Pain exploded up my leg, and when I looked down, my right foot was gone, just gone, torn clean off like it was nothing. I screamed, Don't know if it was from the pain or the sheer terror of knowing that this thing, whatever it was real and I was about to die. But then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it vanished back into the shadows. I lay there, bleeding out, staring up at the canopy of trees, wondering why I wasn't dead yet. Maybe it didn't finish me off on purpose, or maybe it just didn't care. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. With whatever strength I had left, I crawled toward the sound of the road, praying Jenkins would find me. Every inch felt like an eternity. Blood soaked through my uniform, leaving a trail behind me that felt like a neon sign pointing right at my crippled body. I was leaving a signal for something I couldn't see but knew was watching. I remember looking back once. Through the trees, I saw something standing upright. A silhouette against the darkness, motionless but somehow conveying menace in its stillness. It was observing me, studying my pain, my struggle, and I swear, though I couldn't see a face, I felt its smile. The forest seemed to close in around me as I dragged my mutilated body toward safety. The branches overhead formed patterns that looked like hands reaching down. The roots beneath me twisted like snakes, sometimes seeming to deliberately impede my progress. The whole forest felt alive, conscious, malevolent. I don't know how long I crawled. Time lost all meaning. But eventually, I heard Jenkins calling my name, his voice distant but growing closer. I tried to shout back, but all that came out was a weak gasp. Still, somehow he found me. I remember the look on his face when he saw what was left of my leg. Not shock, he'd expected something like this, but resignation, as if he'd known all along that this would happen to someone eventually. "Why not me? Don't look back," he whispered as he helped me to his truck. "Whatever you do, don't look back at the woods." Of course I did. And there it was again, that shape, that presence, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching. Jenkins saw it too. He muttered something under his breath, an old prayer perhaps, and drove us away from there as fast as his ancient truck could manage. The last thing I remember before passing out was Jenkins radioing ahead to the county hospital. "Got another one," he said simply. "Like the others." The others. There had been others. And no one had told me. I woke up in a hospital bed, leg wrapped up in enough gauze to make me look like a mummy. The first thing I saw was Jenkins sitting by the window, his shotgun propped against the wall. "You're lucky," he grumbled, not looking at me. "Damn thing left you alive." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. What the hell was it? My voice was hoarse, throat raw from screaming. Jenkins turned to face me, his eyes colder than they'd been before. "It ain't something from this world, deputy. Been here longer than you or me. Maybe longer than this land itself. I told you not to go in there." I didn't say anything. What could I say? I had my leg taken off by something I couldn't even describe. And the more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it all sounded. But it wasn't a joke. No punchline was coming to save me. The hospital room was small and sterile, the fluorescent lights too bright after the darkness of the forest. An IV dripped clear fluid into my arm, and a monitor beeped steadily next to me. Through the window I could see the town of Pine Ridge, its streets empty in the early morning light. And beyond that, in the distance, the dark line of trees that marked Devil's Wood. "How long have I been out?" I asked, my mouth dry. 2 days, Jenkins replied. "They had to take more of your leg. Infection, they said. But I know better." I looked down at the shape under the blanket. Where my right leg should have been, the blanket lay flat from mid-thigh down. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just missing a foot. Half my leg was gone. "Why didn't anyone warn me?" I asked, anger seeping into my voice. "About what's in those woods?" Jenkins sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Would you have believed us? We tried warning the others too. They all thought we were just superstitious country folk." He stood up, grabbing his shotgun. "Rest up, deputy. Sheriff's coming by later." As he reached the door, I called after him. "Jenkins, have you ever seen it clearly, the thing in the woods?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Once, back in '87, took my brother. What was left of him we buried in a closed casket. He didn't turn around. No one who sees it clearly ever lives long enough to describe it. Consider yourself fortunate." After Jenkins left, a nurse came in to check my vitals. Her name tag read Valerie. She worked efficiently, avoiding eye contact. "How bad is it?" I asked as she adjusted my IV. "Dr. Marino will be in shortly to discuss your condition," she replied, her tone professional but distant. "Not the leg. The thing that did this to me. How many others has it gotten?" Her hands froze for just a second before resuming their work. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Everyone in this town knows. How many others have come in like me, torn up by something in those woods? Valerie glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. 3 this year, a dozen in the time I've worked here. Some didn't make it. She straightened up. We don't talk about it. It's better that way. Better for who? I demanded. For everyone, she said firmly, then left without another word. Dr. Marino arrived an hour later, a gray-haired man with glasses perched on the end of his nose. He explained the extent of my injuries in clinical terms. Severed femoral artery, massive tissue damage, signs of an unknown toxin in my bloodstream that had necessitated removing more of the leg than initially planned. Unknown toxin? I repeated. Like venom? We've sent samples to the state lab, he said, not meeting my eyes. But yes, similar to venom, though unlike anything we've seen before. Doctor, I began. What the hell is in those woods? Dr. Marino removed his glasses, polishing them with the edge of his lab coat. As your physician, I can only address your medical condition. What you encountered, that's a matter for local authorities. I am the local authorities, I reminded him. Then I suggest you speak with Sheriff Reeves. He's waiting outside. With that, Dr. Marino replaced his glasses and left. Sheriff Reeves entered moments later. He looked older than I remembered, the lines in his face deeper, his eyes more shadowed. He placed his hat on the foot of my bed and pulled up the chair Jenkins had vacated. Hell of a thing, he said simply. You knew, I accused. You knew what was out there, and you sent me anyway. Reeves didn't deny it. Would you have believed me if I'd told you? About what really lives in Devil's Wood? Would you have taken me seriously, or would you have thought I was just another crazy old hick? He had a point, and we both knew it. I would have nodded politely while thinking he'd lost his mind. So what is it? I asked. Honest truth? Nobody knows for sure. Been here as long as there's been a Pine Ridge County. Longer, according to the native folks who used to live here. They avoided that forest entirely. But what is it? Some kind of animal? Reeves shook his head. Not an animal. Not as we understand them. It hunts, yes. It kills. But it's selective, deliberate. It doesn't just feed, it plays, studies, learns. He leaned forward. And it's getting bolder. The sheriff told me then about the history of Devil's Wood. How the first settlers had lost children to it. How, every few decades, the attacks would increase in frequency and violence, as if the thing was going through cycles of hibernation and activity. How, in recent years, those cycles had become shorter, the attacks more frequent. We've tried to stop it, Reeves said. Back in '73, a group of men went in with rifles and dynamite. None came back. In '96, the Forest Service wanted to do a controlled burn. The fire wouldn't catch, just wouldn't burn. So everyone just accepts it? I couldn't keep the disbelief from my voice. What choice do we have? Move away? Many have. But some of us, this is our home, has been for generations. We've learned to live with it, to respect the boundaries. By feeding it hikers and tourists? The accusation hung in the air between us. Reeves' eyes hardened. We warned them, all of them, just like we warned you. Not our fault if they don't listen. The sheriff came by later, told me to take my time recovering, and that he'd close the case as animal attack. I laughed at that one. A dark, bitter laugh that turned into a coughing fit. Animal attack? Sure, that's one way to spin it. But I wasn't in the mood to argue. It didn't matter what they called it. I'd never walk the same way again. As Reeves was leaving, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since I woke up. Why didn't it kill me? It could have. Why let me live? The sheriff paused at the door. Maybe it wasn't hungry. Maybe it was curious. Or maybe... He hesitated. Maybe it marked you. Some folks think it chooses certain people, watches them, studies them. For what? No idea. But those people? They never stay lucky for long. With that ominous statement hanging in the air, Sheriff Reeves left. I remained in the hospital for another week, learning the basics of living with one leg, dealing with phantom pain that felt like my missing foot was being crushed over and over, and trying to make sense of what had happened to me. Nights were the worst. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I could hear something scratching at the window, see shadows moving on the ceiling that didn't match the objects in the room. The nurses said it was trauma, PTSD from the attack, but I knew better. The thing from the woods. It had followed me here, not physically perhaps, but it had left a part of itself with me, a connection I couldn't sever as easily as my leg had been. And sometimes, in those moments between waking and sleeping, I swear I could hear it whispering to me, calling me back to Devil's Wood, promising to show me the rest of its secrets, if I was brave enough to return. 2 months passed before I could limp my way back to the Jenkins farm. I had a crutch under my arm and a whole new appreciation for fear. The wood still stood, as ominous as ever, whispering dark secrets I no longer cared to learn. But that wasn't the end. Jenkins told me more cattle had gone missing, and this time the thing had come closer, right up to the edge of the barn. The claw marks on the doors were deeper than before. Whatever it was getting bolder, hungrier. I wasn't the only one who knew it either. The whole town had started whispering the same way they always had. Except this time they weren't just whispers, they were warnings. Folks started packing up, leaving for good. Recovery had been a nightmare of its own. Learning to walk with a prosthetic leg, dealing with the stares, the pity, the questions I couldn't answer truthfully. I'd been put on administrative duty, no more patrols for me, just paperwork and answering phones at the station. Sheriff Reeves made it clear. What happened to me was officially classified as a bear attack, and that's all I was to say about it. But the nightmares continued. Night after night, I'd find myself back in those woods, dragging myself through the underbrush while something watched from the shadows. Only in the dreams, I never made it out. The thing would toy with me, taking pieces bit by bit, a finger here, an ear there, until there was almost nothing left. And still, it wouldn't let me die. I started researching the history of Pine Ridge County, digging through old newspaper archives, looking for patterns. The attacks had been happening for generations, always explained away as animal attacks, tragic accidents, or people simply going missing. But reading between the lines, the truth was there if you knew what to look for. 1887. 3 lumberjacks found partially consumed near what would later be called Devil's Wood. 1924. A family of 4 disappears while camping. Only their wagon and torn clothing discovered. 1956. 5 members of a hunting party go missing. The lone survivor commits suicide a week later, leaving a note that simply read, "It follows." 1973. The expedition Reeves had mentioned. 7 men enter the forest with weapons and explosives. None return. And more recently, a steady stream of hikers, campers, and tourists. Not all killed. Some just experienced close calls or reported strange sightings before leaving town in a hurry. And then there were the livestock mutilations, increasing in frequency over the past year. Something was changing. The pattern was accelerating. Whatever lived in those woods was becoming more active, more aggressive. And somehow, I knew it wasn't finished with me. I visited the county library, where the oldest records were kept. The librarian, Miss Winters, was reluctant to help at first. But when I showed her my badge and mentioned I was investigating historical patterns of animal attacks, she relented. "There might be something in the town founder's journal," she said, leading me to a glass case containing a leather-bound book. Alexander Ridge's personal account of establishing the settlement in 1842. "It's fragile, but I can let you view it here." Miss Winters carefully removed the journal and placed it on a reading desk. "Just be gentle with it. It's one of our most valuable historical documents." The journal was written in faded ink, the handwriting ornate but legible. Most entries were mundane accounts of building cabins, planting crops, dealing with harsh weather. But then I found what I was looking for. Dated November 1843, the native guides refused to take us beyond the Eastern Valley. They say the forest there is home to something they call the hunger that walks. Their superstition is frustrating our expansion efforts, though after what happened to Johnston's survey party, some of the men are beginning to share their fears. 3 good men lost, their remains found in a condition I dare not describe here. Whatever animal is responsible must be hunted down. 2 weeks later, another entry. Our hunting party returned today, or what remains of it. Only Simmons and Carter made it back, both injured and speaking nonsense about a creature that walked like a man but moved faster than any wolf. Carter took his own life this evening. Simmons refuses to speak of what they saw. The men are now refusing to go near the eastern forest. We will have to adjust our settlement boundaries accordingly. And finally, dated spring of 1844. We have come to an arrangement with what dwells in the eastern woods. So long as we respect its territory, it allows us to exist alongside it. This is not defeat, it is pragmatism. Some places are not meant for man. Some hungry gods predate our claims to this land. I closed the journal, my hands shaking slightly. Hungry gods. The founder of Pine Ridge had eventually recognized what they were dealing with wasn't an animal, wasn't something that could be hunted or driven away. It was something older, something that considered humans as little more than occasional prey or amusement. "Find what you were looking for?" Miss Winters asked, coming to collect the journal. "I'm not sure," I replied honestly. "Did Alexander Ridge write anything else about the eastern forest, or this arrangement he mentioned?" Ms. Winters carefully returned the journal to its case. Not in any documents we have here, but there are stories passed down through certain families. Old Ridge supposedly created some kind of pact, a boundary agreement, you might say. What kind of pact? She hesitated, glancing around the empty library. The kind where sacrifices are made to keep the peace. Livestock, mainly. But in bad years, she trailed off. In bad years? In bad years, when winters were harsh and game was scarce, they'd send someone into the woods. Usually a criminal, or sometimes a volunteer who was old or sick. Someone who wouldn't be missed. Ms. Winters straightened her glasses. But those are just stories, of course. Folk tales to frighten children. I would have believed that once. Not anymore. Has anyone ever killed it? Or tried to? Miss Winters laughed, a short, humorless sound. Every generation thinks they'll be the ones to end it, the ones who finally drive it away or destroy it. None have succeeded. She fixed me with a steady gaze. It was you, wasn't it? You're the deputy who was attacked, the one who lost his leg. I nodded slowly. Then you should know better than most. It can't be killed. It's been here since before us, and it'll be here long after we're gone. She leaned closer. And if it marked you, if it let you live, then it isn't done with you yet. What do you mean, marked me? Some say it chooses certain people, watches them, follows them, even away from the woods. Ms. Winters glanced toward the windows, though from where we stood, Devil's Wood wasn't visible. They say it gets inside your head somehow, makes you hear things, see things, draws you back. The nightmares. The whispers I sometimes thought I heard. The constant feeling of being watched. What happens to those people? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Eventually they go back to the woods. Usually at night. Usually alone. Miss Winters began reshelving books, signaling the end of our conversation. They never come back out. As I left the library, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town. In the distance, Devil's Wood was a dark line against the horizon, and for just a moment I thought I saw something move among the trees. Something tall and misshapen, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, the dreams were worse than ever. I was back in the forest, but this time I wasn't running or crawling. I was walking deeper in, drawn by something I couldn't see but could feel pulling at me like a hook in my soul. Ahead, in a clearing, stood a figure too tall to be human, its proportions wrong in ways that hurt to look at. It beckoned to me with a limb that was neither arm nor claw but something in between, and the worst part, in the dream, I wasn't afraid. I was curious, eager even, as if reuniting with an old friend. I woke up to find myself standing in my kitchen, the front door wide open. I was fully dressed, my prosthetic leg attached, my car keys in my hand. Sleepwalking. I'd been about to drive somewhere, and I had a sickening certainty about where. It was calling me back. And sooner or later I would answer. By December, things in Pine Ridge had reached a breaking point. 3 more hikers had disappeared near Devil's Wood. A child from the outskirts of town had vanished from his backyard, last seen walking toward the tree line. Livestock mutilations had become so common that farmers had taken to bringing their animals into barns at night and posting armed guards. The town was gripped by a silent panic. You could see it in people's eyes at the diner, in the hushed conversations that stopped when you approached, in the way everyone hurried indoors before sunset. Pine Ridge had always coexisted with the thing in the woods through an uneasy truce, but that truce was crumbling, and me? I was deteriorating too. The sleepwalking episodes had increased in frequency. Twice more I'd woken to find myself fully dressed, car keys in hand. Once I'd actually made it to my car before snapping out of it. The dreams had evolved. Now the thing in the woods was speaking to me, not in words exactly, but in concepts and images that burned themselves into my brain. It was showing me things, teaching me things, about itself, about the world, about what waited in the spaces between what humans could perceive. I would have joined the exodus of townspeople leaving for good if I could. But I couldn't. Something told me it wasn't over. Something told me that whatever it was still out there watching. And sooner or later it'd come back to finish what it started. Not today, though. I'm still here. Sheriff Reeves called an emergency town meeting in early January. The community center was packed. Those who hadn't already fled wanted answers, solutions, protection. Reeves looked haggard, his uniform wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. For generations, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. We've lived alongside what dwells in Devil's Wood. We've respected its territory, and in return it's mostly left us alone. Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman stood up. My son is missing. You call that leaving us alone? It's different now, Reeves acknowledged. Something's changed. It's becoming more aggressive, more hungry. Then we need to kill it, someone shouted from the back. Others voiced their agreement. Reeves raised his hands for quiet. Many have tried. None have succeeded. Whatever this thing is, it's not something we can fight with guns and courage. Then what do you suggest? Jenkins asked from his seat near the front. We can't keep living like this. We've contacted state authorities, Reeves said. Told them we have an aggressive bear or mountain lion. They're sending wildlife officers next week. Laughter, bitter and disbelieving, rippled through the room. Everyone knew wildlife officers would be useless against what lurked in those woods. In the meantime, Reeves continued, no one goes near Devil's Wood. No one. We establish a perimeter, post guards if necessary. And if that doesn't work, someone called out. Reeves didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was heavy with the weight of what he was suggesting. Then we do what our ancestors did in times like these. We give it what it wants. Silence fell over the room. Everyone knew what he meant. The old stories, the old ways. A sacrifice. I sat in the back, watching, listening. The prosthetic leg chafed against my stump, a constant reminder of my own encounter. And as I sat there, a thought began to form, not my own, but planted, seeded by the whispers that had invaded my dreams. I knew what had to be done. I knew why it had let me live. After the meeting, I approached Reeves. Sheriff, I need to talk to you, privately. He led me back to his office at the station, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and sat heavily in his chair. I know what you're thinking, he said. I can see it in your face. It marked me, I said simply. It's been calling me back. And I think I'm supposed to go. Reeves downed his whiskey in one gulp. That's the worst idea I've ever heard. Is it? You were about to suggest a sacrifice. Someone to appease it, like in the old days. Well, it's already chosen. It chose me. And you think walking into those woods to die is the answer? I think it doesn't just want to kill me. If it did, it would have finished the job that night. It wants something else. I leaned forward. And maybe, just maybe, if I go to it willingly, it will be satisfied, at least for a while. Reeves refilled his glass, his hand shaking slightly. You don't know what you're talking about. Nobody knows what this thing wants. That's what makes it so dangerous. I've been dreaming about it, I admitted. Every night, it shows me things. And I think it's lonely. The sheriff stared at me. Lonely? You think a monster that's been terrorizing this town for generations is lonely? I didn't say it wasn't a monster. But I think it's also something else. Something older. Something that was here long before humans, that exists in ways we can't fully comprehend. And yes, I think it's lonely. Reeves shook his head. You've lost your mind. Maybe, I conceded. Or maybe it's been changing my mind, preparing me for what? I didn't have an answer to that. Not one I could articulate. But I felt it, a certainty deep in my bones. I'm going back to those woods, Sheriff, tonight, alone. I can't let you do that. You can't stop me. Not unless you plan to lock me up. I stood up, and even then it would just find another way, another person. This ends tonight, one way or another. Reeves looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. At least take this. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out an ancient-looking revolver. Family heirloom. Bullets are silver, won't kill it probably, but might slow it down if you change your mind about this suicide mission. I took the gun, feeling its weight. Thank you, but I won't need it. As the sun set, I drove my cruiser to the edge of Jenkins' property. The old man was waiting for me, as if he'd known I was coming. Heard about your plan, he said, holding a lantern. Damn fool idea. Probably, I agreed, but I have to try. Jenkins nodded toward the dark line of trees. It's active tonight. Been hearing it moving around since dusk. Sounds excited. It knows I'm coming. Likely does. Jenkins handed me the lantern. Won't do much good in there, but take it anyway. You should go inside. Lock your doors. Jenkins chuckled darkly. Wouldn't make a difference if it decided to come for me. But I don't think it will. Not tonight. Tonight, it's waiting for you. I turned toward the forest, feeling a strange calm settle over me. The fear was still there, but muted now. Buried beneath the certainty of what I had to do. Deputy, Jenkins called after me. If by some miracle you make it back out of there, tell us what you saw, what it really is. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and began walking toward Devil's Wood for what I knew would be the last time. The boundary between the open field and the forest seemed more defined than I remembered, like crossing from one world into another. The moment I stepped beneath the canopy of trees, the air changed, became heavier, charged with something like electricity. The temperature dropped noticeably, my breath fogging in front of me. I didn't need the lantern to guide me. I knew exactly where to go, as if following a map etched into my subconscious. Deeper and deeper I went, the underbrush growing thicker, the trees more twisted and ancient. Normal forest sounds, insects, small animals, the rustle of leaves, fell away, replaced by an unnatural silence. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing but not quite. Coming from up ahead where the trees thinned into the clearing locals called the hollow. I should have been terrified. Should have turned and run. But the fear had been replaced by something else. A strange anticipation that I recognized wasn't entirely my own. It had been preparing me for this moment, conditioning me through dreams and whispers to accept what was coming. As I approached the edge of the hollow, I saw it waiting in the center of the clearing. No longer hiding in shadows or flitting at the edge of vision, it stood fully revealed in the moonlight, and my mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. It was tall, impossibly so, standing at least 9 feet. Its body was vaguely humanoid but wrong in proportions. Limbs too long, torso too narrow. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shift between solid and translucent, revealing glimpses of an internal structure that resembled neither bone nor organ but something in between. Where a face should have been was a featureless void that somehow conveyed expression. Right now, a kind of eager expectation. The revolver Reeves had given me felt heavy in my pocket, but I made no move to reach for it. It would have been useless anyway, I knew that now. This thing wasn't just physically present, it existed on multiple planes simultaneously, only partially manifesting in our reality. "I'm here," I said, my voice sounding strange in the unnatural silence of the hollow. "What do you want from me?" It didn't speak, not with words. Instead, images and concepts flooded my mind. I saw flashes of the past, Pine Ridge before it was settled, the forest extending for miles in all directions. I saw the first humans to encounter this being, their terror, their attempts to destroy it, to understand it. I saw the pact they eventually made, regular offerings of livestock, occasional human sacrifices in times of need. And I saw what it wanted now, not just blood or fear or death. It wanted understanding, connection. After centuries of existence, it had grown curious about the creatures that kept encroaching on its territory. It had marked me not just as prey but as a potential ambassador. The concept wasn't quite right, but it was the closest human equivalent. It extended a limb toward me, not the claw that had taken my leg, but something more hand-like, though with too many joints, too many digits. An invitation. I knew then what accepting meant. I wouldn't die, not exactly, but I wouldn't remain human either. I would become something in between, a bridge between worlds. Part of me would live on in this forest, merged with the entity before me, and in exchange Pine Ridge would be safe again. The attacks would stop, the uneasy truce restored. Was it worth it? Sacrificing myself, my humanity, to save a town that had kept secrets from me, that had essentially fed me to this thing. I thought of Jenkins waiting by his farm, of Reeves trying to protect his people the only way he knew how, of all the families that had already fled and those that remained. I took a step forward, then another. The being's appendage was inches from my face now. I could feel its power radiating outward, a cold fire that promised both oblivion and rebirth. "Will it hurt?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I spoke aloud or just thought the question. The answer came as a flood of sensation, pain beyond imagining, followed by an expansion of consciousness that would compensate for any suffering. It would hurt, and then it would transform. I closed my eyes and reached out, my fingers connecting with the being's strange appendage. The world exploded into light and sound and pain. My body felt as if it were being unmade cell by cell, then reconstructed according to an alien blueprint. I was aware of screaming, though I couldn't tell if the sound came from me or from the thing I was becoming part of. Time stretched and collapsed, meaningless in the face of what was happening. When awareness returned, I was still in the hollow, but everything looked different. The world had gained dimensions I hadn't been able to perceive before, colors beyond the human spectrum, sounds at frequencies no human ear could detect. And I could feel the forest around me, every tree, every creature, as extensions of myself. But I wasn't gone. Some core of my humanity remained, preserved like an insect in amber. I was both myself and something else now, something older, something hungry. something that had been lonely for a very, very long time. I would keep my promise. Pine Ridge would be safe again. The attacks would stop. The thing in Devil's Wood had what it wanted, a bridge to understanding the human world. And as for me, I'm still here, in a way, watching, waiting, learning. Sometimes, when the moon is full, you might catch a glimpse of me moving between the trees at the edge of town. Don't be afraid. I remember what it was to be human. I remember compassion, mercy, sacrifice, but I remember hunger too. And the forest must be respected. The boundaries must be maintained. That was the deal after all. That was the price of peace. So if you find yourself near Pine Ridge County, heed the warnings. Stay away from Devil's Wood. Not every sacrifice ends like mine. Not everyone who enters those trees becomes something new. Most just become food. And the hunger? It never truly goes away. I've been a park ranger for 12 years now. Most people think the job is all fresh air and pointing tourists toward the best views, but those of us who've worked in the more remote parks know differently. Nature isn't just beautiful, it's indifferent to human life. It's unforgiving, and sometimes it feels almost hostile. My transfer to Cascade Ridge National Forest came after a particularly rough stint in Yellowstone. The supervisors thought I could use something quieter, as they put it. Cascade Ridge was smaller, less visited, and tucked away in the northwestern mountains where dense pine forests stretched for miles, interrupted only by rocky outcroppings and the occasional alpine meadow. The ranger station was 30 miles from the nearest town, a small settlement called River Point, with one gas station and a general store that doubled as the post office. My cabin sat another 5 miles into the park, a sturdy wooden structure with solar panels, a small generator for backup, and satellite internet that worked about half the time. Perfect for someone who needs space, my supervisor had said during orientation. What he meant was, perfect for someone who'd had an incident, the kind where you find a hiker too late and the memory of it follows you home. My first week passed uneventfully. I patrolled the main trails, checked permits at the few designated camping areas, and spent evenings logging data and reading reports from previous rangers. The forest was eerily quiet compared to Yellowstone's tourist chaos. Here the silence had weight, broken only by wind through pine needles and occasional wildlife calls. On my 8th night, I was awakened by something striking my cabin. It wasn't loud, more like something brushing against the outer wall. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut through darkness but revealed nothing unusual. The forest stood silent, the kind of heavy silence that feels expectant. I checked the perimeter, finding nothing but some disturbed gravel near the west side. Probably raccoons, I thought. Or maybe a deer. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something odd. A smell I couldn't place, not the usual forest sense of pine, soil, and vegetation. This was musky, almost primal. It disappeared as quickly as it had come. The next morning, I found large, unusual tracks in the soft earth behind my cabin. They resembled bear prints but weren't quite right, too large, with a strange formation to the toes. I photographed them before they disappeared in the morning rain, intending to ask wildlife services about them. That afternoon, I received my first emergency call. A family of 4 had wandered off the main trail and become disoriented. Standard procedure. I gathered my pack and headed to their last known coordinates. The Hoffmans, parents with 2 preteen children, were relieved when I found them 3 miles off trail. They'd followed what they thought was a path but was actually a dry creek bed that had led them deeper into the wilderness. We kept hearing something following us, Mr. Hoffman explained as I guided them back. Like footsteps, but heavy, really heavy. Probably a moose or elk, I offered. They're curious but generally keep their distance. Mrs. Hoffman glanced nervously at the darkening forest. It sounded bigger. The children were unusually quiet, the younger one clutching a drawing pad to his chest. As we approached the main trail, I asked to see what he'd been drawing. He hesitated before revealing a crude crayon sketch, tall trees, and what looked like a large, dark figure standing between them. "That's what watched us from the trees," he whispered. Children often misinterpret shadows or large animals, especially when scared. I smiled reassuringly and got them safely back to their vehicle. But driving back to my cabin, I couldn't shake the memory of those strange tracks, or the lingering question of what exactly was watching us from the dense forest beyond. The incident report for the Hoffman family took longer than usual to complete. I found myself staring at the section labeled Wildlife Encounters, cursor blinking as I debated how to categorize what they'd described. In the end, I marked it as possible elk sighting and added notes about the child's drawing. 2 days later, I discovered the first truly unsettling sign that something wasn't right in my section of Cascade Ridge. While checking the northwestern trail markers, I found a half-eaten deer carcass spread across the path. This wasn't unusual in itself. Predation is natural, but the way it had been torn apart was strange. The ribcage was completely exposed, with bones broken outward as if something had pulled them apart. No mountain lion or wolf typically feeds this way. I radioed wildlife management, who suggested it might be bears exhibiting unusual behavior due to food scarcity. They promised to send someone out within the week, but in the isolated reaches of Cascade Ridge, within the week could mean anything. That night, I awoke to the sound of wood creaking, not the normal settling noises of a cabin, but deliberate pressure, as if something heavy was leaning against the far wall. My heart hammered as I reached for the rifle I kept under my bed. The creaking stopped, replaced by what sounded like deep, rasping breath. I remained frozen, listening as whatever it was circled the cabin, pausing occasionally as if studying the structure. The windows were too high for a bear to look through, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. After what seemed like hours, heavy footsteps retreated into the forest. Come morning, I found new tracks, similar to those I'd photographed earlier but deeper, as if made by something heavier. More disturbing were the long scratches on the cabin's western wall, about 8 feet up, too high for most wildlife. I'd read incident reports from previous rangers about unusual wildlife encounters but had dismissed most as exaggeration. Working alone in the wilderness does things to your mind. Isolation breeds imagination. At least, that's what I told myself as I measured the scratches and documented them. That afternoon, a call came in about a solo hiker who hadn't checked in at his designated time. Getting lost is easy in Cascade Ridge, where trails disappear under fallen leaves and landmarks look deceptively similar. I grabbed my gear and headed out, hoping to find him before sunset. The coordinates led me to the densest part of the forest, where ancient pines blocked most sunlight. 4 hours of searching yielded nothing until I noticed a bright blue fabric piece caught on a branch. Following the sign, I discovered a small clearing where the missing hiker had established camp. His tent stood intact but empty, sleeping bag still inside. His hiking boots remained neatly placed at the entrance, a detail that sent cold prickles across my skin. No experienced hiker ventures barefoot into these woods. As I examined the area, I realized the ground told a story. There were the hiker's normal boot prints around the campsite, then what looked like barefoot running tracks leading into the trees. Following them cautiously, I found where they stopped abruptly at the base of a massive pine. Scattered nearby were pages from a journal, the most recent entries still legible. Night 3, something is watching me from the tree line. I hear it moving after dark, circling my camp. It's big, too big for a bear. I tried recording the sounds, but my phone battery is almost dead. I think I saw it today, just for a second. Tall, moving quickly between trees. Park documents don't mention anything like this living here. If anyone finds this, the entry ended abruptly. I gathered the pages and continued searching until darkness forced me back. As I hiked out, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Twigs snapped behind me at irregular intervals, always stopping when I turned to look. Just wildlife, I muttered to myself, quickening my pace. But the rational part of my mind, the part trained through years of wilderness experience, knew that wildlife doesn't follow humans with such purpose. Wildlife doesn't maintain a consistent distance, and wildlife doesn't seem to understand exactly when you're turning to look. I reached my vehicle as night fully descended, throwing my gear inside and locking the doors before allowing myself to breathe. As I started the engine, my headlights swept across the tree line, and for just a second I caught a glimpse of something tall retreating into darkness. Something that moved on 2 legs, not 4. I drove back to my cabin faster than regulations allowed, the missing hiker's journal pages burning a hole in my pack. Morning brought no relief from my growing unease. I radioed for a search and rescue team for the missing hiker, identified from his abandoned belongings as Michael Westfield, 35, experienced backpacker from Portland. While waiting for the team to arrive, I reviewed his journal again, trying to make sense of the scattered entries. The earlier pages documented normal hiking observations, wildlife sightings, weather conditions, trail notes. But about halfway through, the tone shifted. Westfield had begun reporting unusual sounds at night and a persistent feeling of being watched. His final entries grew increasingly paranoid, with repeated mentions of movement in the trees and breathing sounds outside my tent. When the search team arrived, 4 rangers from neighboring districts, I shared my findings and the journal entries. I could see skepticism in their expressions. Sounds like he got spooked and wandered off. suggested Ranger Brennan, the most experienced among them. Happens more often than you'd think. People get wilderness anxiety, especially alone. I wanted to believe this explanation, but the abandoned boots troubled me. We spent the next 8 hours combing the area in expanding circles from Westfield's campsite, finding nothing but a few more scattered personal items. A water bottle, a torn shirt, a single sock. As the search continued, 2 of the rangers reported hearing unusual sounds, heavy movement through the underbrush that stopped whenever they paused to listen. Brennan dismissed it as wildlife, but I noticed how his hand rested closer to his sidearm afterward. We suspended the search at dusk, agreeing to resume at first light. The others headed back to town while I returned to my cabin, the day's events weighing heavily on my mind. At night brought the worst storm of the season. Thunder crashed overhead as rain pounded my cabin roof. Around midnight, between thunderclaps, I heard a distinctive sound. 3 heavy knocks on the side of my cabin. Then 3 more, too deliberate for falling branches. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, heart racing. The knocking came again, this time from the opposite wall. Whatever was out there was moving around my cabin, testing it. I stood motionless in the center of the room, tracking the sounds as they circled the structure. When lightning flashed, illuminating the windows, I caught a glimpse of something peering in, just for a second. A dark shape too tall for a bear, with what looked like a massive head outlined against the glass. I raised my rifle instinctively, but it disappeared before I could process what I'd seen. The radio crackled to life, making me jump. It was Brennan, his voice tense. We found something. Westfield's backpack, about 2 miles north of his camp. And tracks, like nothing I've seen before. Human? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. No, he replied after a pause. Not human. Not any wildlife I recognize either. Too big, wrong configuration, and there's hair caught in the backpack straps. Dark, coarse, not Westfield's. I thought of the tracks I'd documented. The scratches high on my cabin wall, the shape at my window. Send samples to the lab, I instructed. And be careful out there. Something doesn't feel right about this. The storm continued through the night, but the knocking didn't return. In the morning, I found massive, unusual footprints in the mud surrounding my cabin, over 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. I photographed them beside my boot for scale, feeling cold dread settle in my stomach. 3 more hikers reported strange encounters that week. One couple described hearing whooping calls echoing through the valley at sunset. Another man abandoned his camping trip after finding his food cache destroyed and large, human-like handprints pressed into the mud nearby. The most disturbing report came from a wildlife photographer who showed me images he'd captured on his trail camera. Most were normal forest scenes, but one night shot showed a large dark figure moving between trees. The image was blurry, indistinct, but clearly showed something bipedal and massive. Too tall and broad-shouldered for a human, but moving with unmistakable purpose. I've heard stories, the photographer said quietly as he packed his equipment, about things in these woods, things the agencies don't acknowledge. The locals in River Point call it the Ridge Walker. I'd heard such legends before. Every remote wilderness has its folklore. But folklore doesn't leave tracks. It doesn't break deer rib cages or knock on cabin walls. And it doesn't leave hair samples that, according to the preliminary lab report Brennan forwarded me, were unidentified primate, not consistent with known species. As I patrolled the boundaries of my sector that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't monitoring the forest. The forest was monitoring me. Eyes followed my movement from the dense undergrowth, branches swayed without wind, and occasionally, just at the edge of hearing, came sounds like wood striking wood. Communication from something that understood concealment. I no longer believed I was dealing with normal wildlife. Whatever walked the ridges of Cascade Forest was something else entirely. 2 weeks after Michael Westfield's disappearance, with no further sign of him despite expanded search efforts, the regional office decided to temporarily close my section of Cascade Ridge to visitors. The official reason given was wildlife management concerns, but rumors had already started circulating among the hiking community. I spent those quiet days compiling evidence. Photographs of tracks, recordings of strange sounds in the night, hair samples, and detailed logs of every unusual occurrence. When compared chronologically, a pattern emerged. The activity intensified around my cabin following the full moon and seemed to migrate in a roughly circular path through my sector. Whatever was out there seemed curious about human presence rather than openly hostile. Until the incident with the research team, the university field researchers arrived despite the closure, armed with special permits to conduct their annual bird migration study. 4 graduate students and their professor set up sophisticated recording equipment at 3 locations near the ridge. I warned them about the unusual activity, but the professor, a veteran of many field expeditions, dismissed my concerns. "We've worked in grizzly territory before," he assured me. "The students are trained in wildlife safety." 3 days into their research, I received a panicked radio call from their base camp. The transmission cut in and out, but I could make out enough. Something had destroyed their equipment at 2 recording sites and was now circling their camp. They could hear it moving through the trees, occasionally emitting low, rumbling sounds. I grabbed my gear and drove toward their coordinates, trying to maintain radio contact. When I was still 2 miles out, I heard screams over the transmission, then silence. I arrived to find their camp in disarray, tents torn open, equipment scattered. 3 researchers huddled in their remaining vehicle, visibly shaken. The professor and 1 student were missing. "It was huge," one of the students told me, hands trembling. "It came out of the trees just after sunset, not like a bear. It was standing upright, at least 7 feet tall. The professor tried to photograph it, and it charged him." They'd heard the professor and the missing student crashing through the underbrush, pursued by heavy footfalls. Then nothing. I radioed for emergency backup and told the remaining researchers to drive to the ranger station while I tracked their colleagues. The fading daylight made it a dangerous proposition, but waiting until morning wasn't an option. The trail wasn't hard to follow. Broken branches, disturbed ground, and occasional equipment items marked a clear path heading west toward the densest part of the forest. I moved carefully, rifle ready, fighting the growing darkness. About a mile from camp, I found the professor's camera, its display smashed. Further on, a single boot. The tracks told a chaotic story, the humans running, falling, getting up again, pursued by something with a long stride that sometimes dropped to all fours. Just as light failed completely, I reached a rock outcropping where the trail ended abruptly. My flashlight beam caught a splash of color against the gray stone, the missing student's red jacket, torn and dirty but empty. I called out, hearing my voice echo back from the rocks. Then, from somewhere above and behind me came a response, not human words, but a long, low vocalization that raised every hair on my body, a sound that conveyed clear meaning, warning. I pivoted slowly, raising my light toward a ledge about 30 feet up. For one heart-stopping moment, my beam illuminated a massive figure crouched there, broad-shouldered, covered in dark hair, with a face that seemed both human and not. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I understood I was being evaluated by something intelligent. It made that sound again. A rumbling call that vibrated in my chest, then rose to its full height. Even at that distance, its size was staggering. Then, with shocking agility for something so large, it disappeared over the ridge. I stood frozen, unable to process what I'd just seen. My training told me to pursue, to complete my search for the missing people, but deeper instincts, older and wiser than any protocol, told me to retreat. As if confirming this instinct, a barrage of rocks suddenly rained down from above, striking the ground around me. Not random falling debris, targeted projectiles. A clear message. I backed away slowly, keeping my light trained on the ridge. More rocks fell, closer this time. I turned and moved quickly back toward my vehicle, feeling watched every step of the way. When backup arrived an hour later, 4 rangers and 2 county sheriff deputies, I struggled to describe what I'd experienced. I showed them my evidence, the tracks, the destroyed equipment. In the harsh reality of flashlights and radios, my encounter seemed increasingly unbelievable. "We'll resume the search at first light," the lead deputy decided. With dogs and a full team, I didn't tell him that dogs would be useless. They'd refused to track during previous searches, whining and retreating when brought to areas with the strange tracks. Some things, it seemed, were beyond their training. That night, gathered in my cabin, the backup team discussed search strategies while I sat silently, replaying the encounter in my mind. I knew what I'd seen. I also knew what saying it out loud would sound like. In the morning, 50 yards from my cabin, we found the missing professor and student, alive, huddled in the hollow of a massive fallen tree. They were disoriented, covered in scratches, but largely unharmed. Their story came out in confused fragments, being chased, seeking refuge in the rocks, then being herded away by something large that stayed just out of clear sight. "It could have hurt us," the professor kept saying. But it didn't. It was containing us, moving us, like we were being relocated. The official report would later call it a bear encounter with unusual characteristics. The university withdrew their research permit. The missing hikers were never found, and Michael Westfield became another statistic. one of the dozens who vanish in national parks each year. But I knew what walked the ridges of this forest, something ancient that had claimed this territory long before our trails and campsites. Something that was growing less tolerant of human intrusion. The regional office sent investigative teams after the research group incident. They combed the forest with thermal imaging cameras and audio equipment but found nothing conclusive. The hair samples came back with inconclusive DNA results, contaminated or insufficient data according to the labs. Official reports attributed the events to an unusually territorial bear, possibly with behavioral abnormalities. My own reports, detailed and meticulous, were filed away with minimal comment. I heard through unofficial channels that some at headquarters considered me compromised by stress and there was talk of mandatory leave. I knew what this meant. I'd seen it happen before to rangers who reported things that didn't fit neatly into scientific categories. The wilderness holds secrets that our reports and databases aren't designed to accommodate. As summer turned to fall, hiking traffic decreased, leaving me increasingly isolated. My radio communications with other stations grew less frequent. I found myself standing at my cabin windows for hours, watching the tree line, waiting for movement. Sleep became elusive, broken by sounds that might have been branches in the wind or might have been something moving around my cabin. The most unsettling development came when I realized the pattern had changed. Whatever was out there no longer circled at a distance. It was watching more closely, more consistently. Some mornings I would find branches arranged in unusual patterns near my cabin. Once, a freshly killed rabbit was placed on my porch steps, not torn apart, just neatly killed and positioned centrally, like an offering. I began carrying a recorder everywhere, documenting unusual sounds. Late one evening, while reviewing the day's recordings, I captured something extraordinary. A series of what sounded like words, distorted but with unmistakable cadence and pattern, too structured for animal sounds, too strange for human speech. When I played it at half speed, goosebumps rose along my arms. The vocalizations contained repeated elements that almost resembled phrases. Was it trying to communicate? The thought both fascinated and terrified me. Against regulations, I began leaving small food items at the forest edge. Apples, packets of dried meat, which would disappear overnight. A dangerous game, I knew. Feeding wildlife is strictly prohibited for good reason, but this felt different. Like establishing diplomatic relations with a sovereign nation. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. After a particularly violent storm that knocked out power to my cabin, I woke at dawn to find my generator dragged from its housing and placed 30 yards away, completely intact. It would have taken tremendous strength to move the heavy equipment without damaging it. More surprising was what replaced it. A large, freshly killed elk, positioned so that its body blocked my cabin door. Not threatening, but impossible to ignore. A gift requiring acknowledgement. I documented everything meticulously before moving the elk and retrieving my generator. That night, I sat on my porch and did something I'd been considering for weeks. I attempted communication. Using a series of wood blocks, I created a simple rhythm: 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. Mimicking the knocking sounds I'd heard in the forest, I repeated this pattern for nearly an hour before getting a response. From the darkness beyond my cabin lights came an answering rhythm. Identical at first, then varying in complex ways. I matched each new pattern as best I could, creating a primitive conversation that continued until midnight. In the morning, I found new tracks circling my cabin, closer than ever before, and branches arranged in patterns too deliberate to be random. One formation resembled a crude arrow pointing deeper into the forest. I stood at the edge of my clearing, staring at that invitation, weighing years of training against growing certainty. Whatever walked these woods was intelligent, territorial, but not mindlessly aggressive. It was studying me as carefully as I was studying it. Against every protocol, I decided to follow where it led. I packed a day bag with essentials, left my scheduled route with the main office, though not my actual destination, and followed the direction of the branch arrow. Every few hundred yards, I found new signs, broken branches, arranged stones, once a clear handprint pressed into soft earth that dwarfed my own. The path led to parts of the forest I'd never patrolled, increasingly remote and primeval. Ancient trees blocked most sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. The normal forest sounds, birds, small mammals, gradually diminished until the only sound was my own breathing and footsteps. After several hours, I reached a small valley nestled between steep ridges. The trees here grew unusually large, many bearing claw marks 8 to 10 feet up their trunks, territory markings, At the center of the valley stood a massive old-growth pine, its base surrounded by a collection of objects that stopped me cold. Arranged in concentric circles were items from throughout the park. A hiker's lost water bottle, pieces of broken research equipment, a child's dropped toy, a torn backpack I recognized as Michael Westfield's. In the center lay a perfectly preserved ranger hat, not mine, but identical to it. A message, unmistakable in its meaning: I see everything that happens here. As I photographed this collection with shaking hands, I became aware of a presence behind me. I turned slowly, camera still raised, and saw it. Standing at the tree line, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakably present, was a figure at least 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered and powerful, covered in dark hair, with a face that seemed both ape-like and disturbingly intelligent. It made no threatening movement, simply watching me with deep-set eyes that reflected a comprehension I couldn't begin to understand. We regarded each other across 50 yards of clearing. My finger hovered over the camera button, knowing this was the evidence that would validate everything, but something stopped me. An unspoken understanding passed between us. This wasn't my discovery to broadcast. The creature raised one massive hand in what might have been a gesture of acknowledgement. Then, with shocking silence for something so large, it faded back into the forest. I could have pursued, could have returned with teams and equipment and traps. That was the protocol, the human response to the unknown. Instead, I lowered my camera and left the clearing undisturbed, taking only my memories and a new understanding. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some knowledge isn't meant to be documented in reports. Winter came early to Cascade Ridge, bringing heavy snow that sealed off the more remote trails and limited my patrols to areas near major access roads. The regional office, still concerned about the summer's incidents, assigned a second ranger to my sector, a young, enthusiastic recent graduate named Rivera who viewed my stories with polite skepticism. Their activity can be really territorial, he'd say whenever I mentioned the unusual tracks or vocalizations, especially when they're preparing for hibernation. I stopped trying to convince him after the first week. Instead, I focused on documenting the subtle changes around us, how certain areas of the forest had become eerily quiet, devoid of normal wildlife, how the tracks appeared less frequently but more deliberately, often in locations where Rivera had recently patrolled. It was watching him I realized. Learning about this new human in its territory, December brought the heaviest snowfall in decades, cutting off road access to our station for nearly 2 weeks. Rivera grew increasingly restless in the isolation, but I found a strange comfort in it. The white silence simplified everything, making the forest's patterns easier to read. On the night of the winter solstice, the longest darkness of the year, the temperature dropped to record lows. Our backup generator failed around midnight, plunging the station into cold darkness. Rivera wanted to try reaching the main road for help, but I knew that attempting the snow-covered trails at night would be suicide. "We wait until morning," I insisted. "Use the emergency blankets and conserve body heat." Huddled in the main room, we listened as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Rivera dozed fitfully while I kept watch, staring into the darkness beyond our walls. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, the distinctive knocking sound I'd come to recognize, 3 beats against the side of the station. Rivera jerked awake, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. The knocking came again, this time followed by heavy movement on our roof. Something massive was up there, moving with surprising delicacy across the snow-laden structure. "Just the storm," I lied, watching Rivera's frightened face. "Go back to sleep." But Rivera had already grabbed his flashlight, pointing it toward the ceiling where dust drifted down from the rafters under some great weight. The knocking intensified, now coming from multiple directions, not random but patterned, rhythmic. "There's something out there," Rivera breathed, reaching for his sidearm. "Don't," I warned, placing my hand over his. "Just listen." The patterns continued, complex and deliberate. Between them came vocalizations, low, rumbling calls that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere animal sounds. I recognized elements from my previous encounters, questions perhaps, or warnings. Rivera stared at me, comprehension dawning. "You know what this is," he said. "All those reports you filed. You weren't exaggerating." I nodded slowly. "They're curious about you. New humans make them uneasy." "They?" Rivera whispered, eyes darting to the windows. Before I could answer, a tremendous crash came from the storage room. We rushed in to find the external door torn from its hinges, night air and snow swirling in. On the threshold lay 3 freshly killed rabbits, food for the stranded humans. Rivera stumbled backward. What What is happening? I stepped forward and picked up the rabbits. An offering, I explained. They know we're in trouble. From the darkness beyond the broken door came that rumbling vocalization again. Closer now, unmistakable. Rivera raised his flashlight with trembling hands, the beam cutting through swirling snow to illuminate a massive figure standing just beyond the doorway. For the first time, I saw it clearly. Over 8 feet of powerful, hair-covered body, standing upright, with an intelligence in its eyes that no bear could possess. It made no threatening move, simply watching us with what seemed like concern. Rivera's flashlight clattered to the floor. That's impossible, he gasped. No, I said quietly. Just undocumented. The creature regarded us for a long moment, then deliberately turned and moved to our generator shed. We watched through the window as it effortlessly cleared snow from the equipment and, with surprising dexterity, began examining the machinery. It's trying to help, I explained to the astonished Rivera. They understand more than we realize. Within 20 minutes, the generator roared back to life. The fuel line had been cleared and reconnected. Heat began flowing through the station again. The creature returned to the broken doorway, regarding us with what could only be described as satisfaction before melting back into the darkness. Rivera sat silent for a long time afterward, his worldview visibly crumbling. We need to report this, he finally said. And say what? I asked. That the officially non-existent Sasquatch fixed our generator. That would end both our careers. But the evidence, the door, the tracks, will be attributed to bears or storm damage, I finished. Like always, I spent the remainder of that night explaining everything I'd learned. The territorial patterns, the communication attempts, the deliberate interactions that demonstrated not just animal instinct, but rational thought. Rivera listened without interruption, his expression shifting from disbelief to wonder. By morning, when the snow had lessened enough to begin repairs, he had reached the same conclusion I had months before. Some things exist in the margins between our knowledge and our imagination, demanding not capture or study but respect. We reported the generator failure and door damage as storm-related incidents. We documented the tracks as unusual wildlife activity, and we developed an unspoken protocol for certain areas of the forest. Regions that would be marked on official maps as environmentally sensitive, but which we understood differently. Spring brought new hikers to Cascade Ridge, all of whom received careful orientation about staying on marked trails and respecting wilderness boundaries. When asked about local legends, we neither confirmed nor denied. The forest demands respect, became our standard answer. Some areas are best left undisturbed. Incidents decreased dramatically. Occasionally, new rangers would report unusual sounds or tracks, and Rivera and I would investigate, documenting what needed to be documented while protecting what needed to be protected. On rare nights, when patrolling the boundaries between their territory and ours, I would hear those distinctive knocks echoing through the trees. Sometimes, I would answer with my own pattern, continuing our primitive conversation across the divide between worlds. The forest holds ancient secrets that our reports and taxonomies can't contain. In the deepest woods of Cascade Ridge lives proof that humanity hasn't cataloged every mystery or mapped every wonder. And perhaps that's as it should be. Some boundaries exist not to be crossed, but to be acknowledged. A mutual agreement between species sharing the same ancient earth. These events occurred during my tenure as a senior ranger at what I've called Cascade Ridge. Names and specific locations have been altered to protect both the privacy of those involved and the continued sanctity of certain wilderness areas. What walks those forests deserves its freedom and its secrets. The isolation hits you differently after dark. That's what they don't tell you in ranger school. Sure, they prepare you for the technical aspects, search and rescue protocols, wildlife management, visitor services, but nothing prepares you for the absolute silence of the backcountry at 2 a.m. when you're the only human for 30 miles in any direction. I'd been stationed at Blackwater Ridge National Forest for 3 years when the incidents began. My cabin, a sturdy but sparse ranger outpost built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, sat perched on the edge of one of the most remote wilderness areas in the Pacific Northwest. The nearest town, Pinecrest, was a 90-minute drive down a winding Forest Service road that became impassable after heavy snowfall. Most rangers rotated out after a year. The isolation drove them back to districts with cell service and human contact. But I'd requested the assignment specifically for its remoteness. After 2 tours in Afghanistan, crowded spaces made my skin crawl. Here, the silence was therapeutic, usually. That night in early October, I was curled up with a dog-eared copy of The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. a horror novel that felt too appropriate given my surroundings. Rangers developed gallows humor quickly. Reading about supernatural forest entities while surrounded by ancient trees seemed fitting. Thunder rolled in the distance as rain pelted my cabin's metal roof. The radio crackled to life. Ranger Station 7, this is dispatch. We've got a 1057, possible lost hikers. Family of 3 missed check-in at Wolverine Trailhead. Last known position, Grid E7, Silverback Ridge. Respond, over. I set down the book and grabbed the radio. Dispatch. This is Ranger Station 7. Copy 1057 at Grid E7. Weather conditions deteriorating here. Beginning search preparations. ETA to last known coordinates approximately 2 hours. Over. Copy that 7. Be advised, storm system intensifying. National Weather Service indicates potential flash flood conditions in lower elevations. Proceed with caution. Over. Understood, dispatch. We'll maintain regular comms. 7 out. I sighed, eyeing the rain lashing against my windows. Search and rescue operations were routine, but night searches during storms were dangerous. Still, people needed help, and that's what I signed up for. As I gathered my gear, heavy-duty flashlight, first aid kit, GPS, topographic maps, emergency rations, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. 26 missing hikers in the past decade. Most found alive, a few found dead from exposure or falls, and 3 never found at all. Statistics I knew too well. I pulled on my Gore-Tex rain gear and loaded my pack into the Forest Service Jeep. The radio reported the missing hikers as the Collins family, father, mother, and 10-year-old son, relatively experienced but not equipped for overnight or severe weather. The Forest Service road was already turning to mud as I navigated the hairpin turns, headlights barely penetrating the curtain of rain. Through the trees, occasional lightning illuminated the ancient forest in stark, momentary tableaus. This part of the Blackwater Ridge was old growth, trees standing since before European colonization, the kind of pristine wilderness that made you feel like an intruder. Reaching the trailhead, I geared up for the hike to their last known position. The rain had temporarily subsided, but the wind whistled through the canopy above, carrying strange sounds from deep in the forest. I'd learned to distinguish the normal forest sounds, owls, coyotes, the occasional cougar, from the abnormal. Tonight, something felt off. 3 miles up the muddy trail, my flashlight caught something reflective, an emergency blanket tied to a tree branch, fluttering in the wind. Not part of standard trail markers. Someone had left it deliberately. I approached cautiously, sweeping my light across the surrounding brush. That's when I noticed the footprints, not the tread patterns of hiking boots, but something else entirely. Enormous, deep impressions in the mud, spaced widely apart, leading off the trail into the dense underbrush. Whatever made them was heavy. Much heavier than a human, and much, much larger than any black bear native to these mountains. The radio at my hip crackled with static, then went silent. I was alone with whatever had left those tracks, and the storm was building again. Lightning flashed, and for just a moment I thought I saw a massive silhouette among the trees ahead, standing upright at least 8 feet tall. When the darkness returned, it was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Rangers develop a sixth sense about being observed. It's necessary when you share the wilderness with predators like mountain lions that stalk before they strike. But this feeling was different, more deliberate, more intelligent. As I followed the trail deeper into Blackwater Ridge, the Collins family had signed the trailhead register indicating they planned a day hike to Monarch Falls and back. 6 miles round trip, manageable for a family with a 10-year-old. But the falls were in the opposite direction from these strange tracks. I tried the radio again. Dispatch, this is Ranger Station 7. I'm at Grid E8 following possible signs of the missing party. Radio reception deteriorating. Will proceed to Silverback Ridge. Over. Only static answered. The rain returned, softer now but persistent. I tracked alongside the unusual footprints, noting how they occasionally disappeared where the ground hardened, then reappeared in muddy patches. Whatever made them knew the terrain well enough to follow established game trails that even experienced hikers would miss. 2 hours into the search, I found the first definitive sign of the Collins family, a child's blue backpack hanging from a branch, placed too deliberately to be accidental. Inside, a water bottle, trail mix, and a small notebook with childish drawings. On the last page, scrawled in pencil, "At follows us." The hair on my neck stood up. I photographed everything before carefully repacking the backpack and securing it in my own. Evidence preservation is protocol, even when every instinct screams to run. Another 30 minutes of hiking brought me to a small clearing. The forest canopy thinned enough to allow moonlight to filter through as the clouds temporarily parted. In the center of the clearing stood a crude structure, branches and limbs arranged in a teepee-like formation, too intentional to be natural, too elaborate to be made by casual hikers. I'd seen similar structures documented in reports from rangers in other districts, reports often filed away with notes about overactive imaginations or folklore enthusiasts. We called them stick structures in ranger circles, sometimes joking about Bigfoot condos. Nobody joked when alone in the woods at night. From the other side of the clearing came a sound that still haunts my dreams, a long, low vocalization that started as a deep rumble and climbed to something between a howl and a scream. No known animal in these mountains makes that sound. I extinguished my flashlight immediately, a primal response to avoid detection. In the darkness, I heard movement, heavy footsteps circling the perimeter of the clearing, methodical and purposeful. Not the random wandering of wildlife, but the deliberate patrol of a predator. My training kicked in. I slowly unholstered my sidearm, standard issue for backcountry rangers, and crouched behind a fallen log, controlling my breathing despite my racing heart. A branch snapped nearby, followed by what sounded disturbingly like words, not English, not any language I recognized, but patterned vocalizations too structured to be animal sounds. Anthropologists call this phenomenon linguistic phonemes, the building blocks of language. I remained motionless as the footsteps drew closer. Through a gap in the log, I could see the clearing in the moonlight. A shadow moved across it, massive, bipedal, with arms that hung almost to its knees. It paused at the stick structure, adding a large branch to the top with deliberate care. From much closer than I expected came a human voice, a child's terrified whisper. It took Mom and Dad. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Less than 10 feet away, huddled in the hollow of a massive cedar, was a young boy, the Collins kid Jacob, according to the missing persons report. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, eyes wide with terror. The creature in the clearing froze, then turned slowly toward our position. I put my finger to my lips, signaling the boy to remain silent. Whatever was out there, it had heard something. The radio at my hip suddenly burst to life with a squawk of static and dispatch's voice. Ranger Station 7, do you copy? Repeat 7, do you copy? The creature's head snapped in our direction. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of a massive silhouette. Broad shoulders, a conical head, fur or hair covering its body. It released that same terrifying howl, now clearly a battle cry, and charged toward our position. I grabbed Jacob, pulled him behind me, and raised my flashlight and weapon simultaneously. The bright beam illuminating the most terrifying sight of my ranger career. The beam caught two reflective eyes, set deep in a face that was both ape-like and disturbingly human. For one eternal second we stared at each other, me with my standard issue Glock, it with hands the size of dinner plates, fingers ending in blackened claws. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in matted dark fur, with a powerful musculature evident even beneath its shaggy coat. The creature flinched from the light, raising one massive arm to shield its eyes. That momentary disorientation gave me the chance I needed. "Run!" I shouted to Jacob, grabbing his arm and sprinting away from the clearing deeper into the forest. The creature's roar echoed behind us, followed by the sound of splintering wood as it crashed through the underbrush in pursuit. We had no chance of outrunning it in a straight chase. Our only advantage was my knowledge of the terrain and the creature's size working against it in the dense forest. I zigzagged between tight clusters of trees, pulling Jacob along, his small legs pumping desperately to keep pace. "My parents," he gasped between breaths. "It took them to its nest." "Save your breath," I urged him. "We'll come back for them." The sound of pursuit suddenly stopped. I slowed, pulling Jacob behind a massive fallen cedar. We crouched in silence, listening, nothing but the gentle patter of rain through leaves. "It hunts by sound," Jacob whispered. "When it gets quiet, that means it's listening." "How do you know that?" I asked, studying his face in the dim moonlight. He seemed oddly composed for a child who had witnessed his parents' abduction. "I read about them. Dad said they weren't real, but I knew better. They've been here longer than us." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the rain. I checked my GPS. We were nearly 2 miles from the nearest ranger station, an emergency shelter stocked with supplies, and a more powerful radio. It was our best chance. "Jacob, I need you to tell me exactly what happened to your parents." Between gulps of water from my canteen, he explained how their day hike had turned nightmarish when they heard strange knocking sounds echoing through the forest. His father, curious, had ventured off-trail to investigate. They found the first stick structure, and soon after, the creature appeared. "It didn't attack right away," Jacob said. "It watched us first. Dad tried to take a picture, and that made it angry. It grabbed Mom first, then Dad when he tried to help her. I ran and hid. It came back looking for me. Did it harm them? I asked gently. I don't think so. It carried them away. They were yelling, but they didn't sound hurt, more scared. I nodded, formulating a plan. There's a ranger shelter a mile northeast of here. We're going to head there, call for backup, and then find your parents. The radio crackled again. This time, I muted it immediately. We couldn't risk giving away our position. As we moved carefully through the forest, I noticed more stick structures. Smaller ones, marking what seemed to be a perimeter or territory. Jacob pointed out broken branches and disturbed vegetation that I'd have missed. Signs of the creature's passage. There's more than one, he whispered as we paused to check our bearings. They have a whole language of wood knocks and whistles. I heard them talking to each other. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving an eerie silence broken only by water dripping from leaves. The temperature was dropping rapidly, typical for October nights in these mountains. We reached a small stream that I recognized. We were close to the emergency shelter. As we crossed, Jacob suddenly froze, pointing to something in the mud of the opposite bank. A line of footprints identical to those I'd found earlier led upstream. Alongside them were two sets of drag marks and partial human footprints, as if two people had been half carried, half dragged. Mom and Dad, Jacob whispered. I studied the tracks, noticing they were fresh, made after the rain stopped, within the last hour. The drag marks showed no signs of blood or struggle, supporting Jacob's belief that his parents were taken alive. The tracks led upstream, away from the shelter, toward the highest and most remote part of the ridge. An area so rugged that even the Forest Service's topographical maps marked it as largely unexplored. I faced a ranger's most difficult decision: follow protocol and get the child to safety, or follow the fresh tracks while they still offered our best chance of finding his parents alive. Jacob made the decision for me. We have to follow them now, he said with a certainty beyond his years. The others never came back. Others? I asked, though I already knew what he meant. The hikers that went missing before. The ones they never found. I'd read all those case files. 3 hikers in the past decade, vanished without a trace despite extensive searches, all in this same region of Blackwater Ridge. How do you know about those cases? I asked. Jacob's expression changed, became almost adult in its solemnity. I found a diary in our rental cabin. It belonged to a ranger. He knew about the creatures, said they've been taking people for generations. A chill ran through me. What rental cabin? The old one near Granite Falls. The owner said a park ranger used to live there before he disappeared. Ranger Robert Masterson. Missing since 1999, his cabin had indeed been sold and converted to a vacation rental after the Forest Service declared him officially deceased in 2006. His case file contained pages of increasingly paranoid journal entries about forest watchers and territories violated. At the time, his superiors had attributed his disappearance to mental health issues. Now, I wasn't so sure. Jacob, I said carefully, did this diary mention where these creatures live? He nodded. The high caves above Thunder Basin, that's where they take people. I checked my GPS. Thunder Basin was 3 miles northeast, in the opposite direction from the shelter. Night was deepening, and the temperature continuing to drop. Following the creatures now meant risking hypothermia, traversing dangerous terrain in darkness, and confronting unknown numbers of the creatures on their home territory. But waiting until morning might mean Jacob's parents wouldn't survive the night. I made my decision and readied my gear. We would follow the tracks, but cautiously, maintaining distance. I would observe and document, not engage. Find the parents if possible, or at least confirm their location before calling in a larger search team. As we set off following the tracks upstream, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being allowed to follow. That something was watching our progress with intelligent, calculating eyes. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. In 20 years of wilderness experience, I'd learned one truth. When the forest goes silent, it means something is hunting. We followed the tracks for nearly an hour, moving with the careful precision that only true fear can inspire. The moon had risen fully now, casting enough light to navigate without flashlights that might give away our position. Jacob moved with surprising stealth for a child, placing his feet exactly where I did, avoiding dry twigs and loose stones that might betray our presence. The tracks led steadily uphill toward Thunder Basin, a high alpine valley surrounded by sheer limestone cliffs honeycombed with caves. The area was notorious among rangers for its frequent and unexplained equipment failures. GPS units malfunctioned, radios picked up strange interference, and compasses sometimes spun uselessly. Most attributed it to iron deposits in the surrounding rock. I was beginning to suspect other explanations. As we climbed higher, the forest thinned, transitioning to scrubby pines and exposed rock faces. The exposed position made me nervous. We'd be easily spotted crossing the last 100 yards to the basin's entrance, a narrow ravine between towering cliffs. I crouched behind a boulder, pulling Jacob down beside me. "We need to wait and watch," I whispered. "See if we can spot movement or signs of your parents." The boy nodded, his eyes constantly scanning the cliff faces above. After several minutes of silence, he tugged my sleeve and pointed to a dark opening about 30 feet up the western cliff face, a cave entrance with what appeared to be deliberate arrangements of branches near its mouth. "There," he whispered. "That's where they'd take them." I raised my binoculars, focusing on the cave. The entrance was partially obscured by what looked like a woven mat of branches and vegetation, camouflage that showed disturbing intelligence and planning. Around the entrance, I could make out symbols or patterns scratched into the rock, circular designs with radiating lines. "How many do you think there are?" I asked Jacob, not really expecting an answer. "7, he said with unsettling certainty. 3 females, 3 males, and the big one, the alpha." I lowered my binoculars, staring at him. "How could you possibly know that?" His eyes remained fixed on the cave entrance. "The diary had counts. The ranger watched them for months before they took him. He drew pictures." He paused. "I have a good memory. I remember everything I read." Before I could question him further, a series of rhythmic knocks echoed through the basin, wood on wood, in a specific pattern, 3 quick, 2 slow, 3 quick, a primitive code. From the opposite side of the basin came an answering pattern, 2 slow, 4 quick. Jacob grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "They know we're here," he hissed. "That's their warning call." I believed him. 20 years in the backcountry teaches you to trust instinct, and every cell in my body was screaming danger. We needed to retreat, regroup, and return with a proper search team. "Jacob, we need to." My words died as a human scream echoed from the cave, a woman's voice, terrified but alive. Jacob's mother. "Mom!" Jacob lurched forward, and I barely caught him before he broke cover. "We can't help them by getting captured too," I hissed, pulling him back. "We need to." A heavy thud behind us cut off my words. We turned slowly. Standing less than 10 feet away was one of the creatures, smaller than the one we'd encountered earlier, but still imposingly large. Its fur was lighter, almost reddish in the moonlight, and its face less pronounced in its brow ridge. "Female," my mind registered absurdly, cataloging details as if this were just another wildlife observation. It made no move toward us, simply watching with eyes that reflected an intelligence that shook me to my core. It held a crude spear, a sharpened stick hardened by fire. Behind it, 2 more creatures emerged from the tree line, the larger one we'd encountered earlier, and another of similar size. All carried primitive weapons. We were surrounded, cut off from escape. My hand moved slowly toward my sidearm, though I knew it would likely only provoke them. Against 1, maybe I'd have a chance. Against 3, with a child to protect, the odds were impossible. The female made a series of clicking sounds followed by deep, rumbling vocalizations. To my shock, Jacob responded with similar sounds, awkward imitations, but recognizable patterns. The creatures froze, exchanging glances that conveyed obvious surprise. "What did you just do?" I whispered. "Told them we came for my parents," Jacob answered, his voice shaking. The diary had phonetic spellings of their language. The ranger figured out some of their words. The largest creature, the alpha, advanced slowly, its massive head tilted in what looked disturbingly like curiosity. It stopped a few feet away, nostrils flaring as it scented the air around us. Then, it did something I still struggle to comprehend. It gestured toward the cave with one massive hand, then stepped aside, creating a path. "It wants us to go to the cave," Jacob whispered. "It's a trap," I replied, though without conviction. If they wanted to harm us, they could have done so already. The alpha made another sound, lower, almost conversational, and pointed again at the cave. "What choice do we have?" Jacob asked. "My parents are in there." "None. We had no choice. Even if I could get off a shot or 2, we'd never outrun them in their territory. Our only option was to play along and look for an opportunity to escape with Jacob's parents." I nodded slowly, keeping my hands visible as I stood. Jacob stayed close to my side as we moved cautiously toward the cave entrance, the 3 creatures falling in behind us like an honor guard or prison escorts. The climb to the cave entrance was treacherous, up a natural stone staircase of weathered limestone. The creatures moved with surprising grace despite their bulk, occasionally reaching out to steady Jacob when he slipped. At the entrance, the female moved ahead, pulling aside the branch covering to reveal a dark tunnel leading deeper into the cliff face. A faint glow emanated from somewhere deep inside, firelight. As we entered the cave, the air changed, warmer, damper, heavy with unfamiliar odors. The tunnel widened into a larger chamber where the source of light became clear. A small, carefully controlled fire in a central pit, vented through a natural chimney in the rock ceiling. Around the chamber's edges, more stick structures formed crude partitions between what were clearly sleeping areas lined with dried vegetation and animal hides. Tools and weapons hung from pegs driven into cracks in the rock walls. Stone hammers bound to wooden handles with sinew, spears with points of napped obsidian, even what appeared to be primitive bowls carved from wood. Not animals, not even simply intelligent primates. This was a culture, and against the far wall, bound with what looked like handcrafted rope of plant fibers, sat Jacob's parents, alive, terrified, but apparently unharmed. "Jacob," his mother cried, struggling against her bonds. "Oh God, Jacob, run!" But it was far too late for that. The alpha creature made a guttural command, and the cave entrance was sealed behind us with a heavy branch barrier. Escape was no longer an option. We were now at the complete mercy of creatures that science insisted didn't exist. The Collins family reunion was brief and tense. The creatures allowed Jacob to embrace his parents but maintained a watchful perimeter around us. I quickly assessed Mr. and Mrs. Collins for injuries, finding only minor scrapes and bruises, while keeping one eye on our captors. "Are you a ranger?" Mr. Collins asked, his voice hoarse. "Is there a rescue team coming?" "Yes to the first, no to the second," I admitted. "No one knows we're here." The alpha creature had settled on a raised portion of the cave floor, watching our interaction with unmistakable interest. The female and the other male positioned themselves near the entrance, occasionally exchanging those strange vocalizations that seemed to constitute language. "What do they want with us?" Mrs. Collins whispered, clutching Jacob protectively. Before I could offer any speculation, Jacob spoke directly to the alpha, producing those same clicking and rumbling sounds he'd made outside. The effort was clearly difficult for him, his human vocal cords struggling with sounds they weren't designed to make. The alpha's reaction was immediate. It leaned forward, eyes widening, then responded with a series of similar sounds. A conversation, of sorts. "What are you saying to it?" I asked Jacob. "I asked why they took my parents," he replied, never taking his eyes off the alpha. "He says they needed to know why we were in their territory." Mr. Collins stared at his son in disbelief. "How are you doing that? Where did you learn that?" "The diary," Jacob and I said simultaneously. The alpha rose suddenly, causing us all to flinch backward. It moved to the rear of the cave and returned carrying something wrapped in what appeared to be a cured deerskin. With ceremonial slowness, it unwrapped the bundle to reveal an object that made my blood run cold. A Forest Service badge. And not just any badge. A specific badge I recognized from the case files I'd studied. Ranger Robert Masterson's badge, missing along with him since 1999. The alpha held the badge toward me, then pointed at my own badge pinned to my jacket. A clear connection being made. "It recognizes the authority," I murmured. "It knows what rangers are." Jacob translated this to the alpha, who nodded, an unsettlingly human gesture, and responded with more of those rumbling vocalizations. "He says the one who wore that badge learned their ways," Jacob translated haltingly. "He lived with them for many seasons before he died." My mind reeled at the implications. Masterson hadn't simply disappeared. He'd been taken, just like the Collins family, but instead of being harmed, he had somehow communicated with these creatures, learned from them, perhaps even lived among them for years while the Forest Service listed him as missing, presumed dead. The alpha made a sweeping gesture around the cave, then pointed to the fire, the tools, the sleeping areas. "He's showing us their home," Jacob said. "He says we're the first to see it in many seasons." Mrs. Collins found her voice. "Ask them why they took us, specifically, why our family." Jacob relayed the question. The alpha's response was lengthy, accompanied by gestures toward Jacob himself. "He says they've been watching people in the forest for generations," Jacob translated slowly. "Most humans are just passing through, but some," he paused, struggling for words, "some have the old blood, can hear them, can learn." The alpha pointed directly at Jacob. "Like me," the boy finished quietly. Mr. Collins pulled his son closer protectively. "What does that mean? What do they want with him?" The alpha seemed to sense the tension and retreated a few steps, making a gesture that even I recognized as meant to be calming. It spoke again, this time directly to me, pointing at my ranger badge, then to itself. then making a sweeping motion that encompassed the entire mountain range visible from the cave entrance. The meaning was clear even without translation. We both protect this territory. Jacob confirmed my interpretation. He says they are the guardians of the old forests. They've watched these mountains since before humans came. They only take action when their territory is threatened. Threatened how? I asked. More vocalizations, more translation from Jacob. The roads, the machines that cut trees, the humans who start fires. They've been forced higher into the mountains, into smaller territories. Conservation. Territory protection. These weren't just intelligent creatures, they were the original forest rangers in a sense. Protectors of a wilderness that humans were steadily encroaching upon. And Ranger Masterson, the one whose badge they have, I asked. The Alpha's response was solemn, accompanied by a gesture that mimicked writing. He recorded their history, Jacob translated, taught some of them human words. When he died, they kept his badge as a sacred object, a connection. A cold realization dawned on me. The diary you found, that wasn't just any diary, was it? It was Masterson's field journal. Jacob nodded. The rental cabin, it was his original outpost. When I found the diary, I started reading it at night. It had all the information about them, the territories, the language, everything. And that's how they found you, I concluded. You were speaking their language, maybe even out loud while practicing. They heard you. The Alpha confirmed this with a nod and more speech. He says they followed us on the hike because they heard me practicing the words near the cabin, Jacob translated. They needed to know how a young one knew their speech. Mrs. Collins looked horrified. Jacob, why didn't you tell us about this diary? You wouldn't have believed me, he said simply. Dad always says Bigfoot isn't real. Mr. Collins had no response to that. The Alpha suddenly tensed, head tilting as if listening. The other creatures mimicked the posture. Something had alerted them. A distant sound reached my ears, the rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors echoing through the mountain basin. Search and rescue, I said, hope rising. When I missed my check-in, they would have launched a search team. The Alpha barked what was clearly an alarm call. The other creatures moved quickly, gathering weapons, dousing the fire. They were preparing either for flight or defense. Jacob called out to the Alpha in its language, his young voice struggling with the complex sounds. The creature paused, listening. I told him these are my people, coming to help, Jacob explained, that they won't harm their territory if we're released. The Alpha seemed to consider this, looking from Jacob to me, then to my ranger badge. A decision was being made. Finally, it approached me directly, towering over my 6-foot frame by at least 2 feet. It extended one massive hand, palm up, in a clear request. I hesitated, then understood. Slowly I unpinned my badge and placed it in the creature's palm. The Alpha examined the badge, then handed it back to me with a solemn nod. It made a series of vocalizations to Jacob. He says they'll release us if I promise to keep their secret, Jacob translated. And if you, as a guardian of the forest, swear to protect their territory from those who would destroy it. The helicopter was getting closer. Soon they'd be using thermal imaging to search the basin. I promise, I said, looking directly into the Alpha's deep, intelligent eyes. No logging permits, no development, no roads. I'll make sure this area remains protected wilderness. I meant every word. 20 years as a ranger had taught me the value of unspoiled wilderness. If these creatures had managed to survive alongside humans for centuries without detection, they deserved their territory. The Alpha seemed to accept my pledge. It barked commands to the others, who quickly began removing the barrier from the cave entrance. He says we must go now, Jacob translated. Down the east path. It leads to the ranger station. They'll watch until we're safe. As we prepared to leave, the Alpha approached Jacob one final time, communicating something directly to him. The boy listened, then nodded solemnly. I promise, he said in English before attempting the creature's language once more. What did you promise? I asked as we were escorted to the cave entrance. Jacob looked up at me, his expression far older than his 10 years. To be a guardian. Like you, like them. The sound of the helicopter grew louder as we emerged from the cave. Down below, searchlights swept the forest floor. Our Sasquatch escorts led us to a hidden trail down the eastern slope, a path no human eyes had mapped. At the edge of the tree line, the Alpha made one final communication to Jacob. He says their kind is dying, the boy translated quietly. There are fewer each generation. Soon humans like me, those who can hear them, may be all that's left to remember they existed. With that, the creatures melted into the darkness between the trees, vanishing so completely it seemed they had never been there at all. I fired a flare into the night sky, signaling the search helicopter. Within minutes, we were surrounded by rescue personnel, wrapped in thermal blankets, being checked for injuries amid a barrage of questions about our ordeal. The official report would cite exposure, disorientation, and the Collins family taking shelter in a natural cave formation. Nothing about 8-foot bipedal primates with their own language and culture. Nothing about Ranger Masterson living among them for years. Some truths aren't meant for official records. As the helicopter lifted us away from Thunder Basin, I looked back at the dark wilderness below. For just a moment, I thought I saw 3 large figures standing at the tree line, watching our departure. Guardians of a secret older than human memory. 6 months have passed since that night in Thunder Basin. Winter came and went, burying the high country under 20 feet of snow, isolating the remote corners of Blackwater Ridge from human intrusion. Now, with spring bringing the first hikers of the season, I find myself more protective of the wilderness than ever before. I requested permanent assignment to Ranger Station 7, surprising my supervisors who knew most rangers considered it a hardship post. The isolation no longer bothers me. In fact, I prefer it. The distance from civilization, from prying eyes, gives me space to fulfill my promise. The Collins family returned to Seattle after their ordeal. Official reports classified their experience as a typical case of hikers becoming disoriented after venturing off established trails. Search and rescue teams found no evidence of unusual tracks or structures. The heavy rain had washed away most signs, and what remained was dismissed as wildlife activity or natural formations. Jacob and I maintained correspondence through letters, no digital trail. His parents sought therapy for him, concerned about what they called his fantasy about forest creatures. But Jacob remained steadfast in his account, at least with me. He's begun studying anthropology and linguistics despite his young age. Some callings begin early. The diary, Masterson's journal, was never found. Jacob claims it disappeared from their rental cabin the night after their rescue. I suspect our forest guardians reclaimed it, removing evidence of their existence. I've made subtle changes to the Forest Service management plans for the Thunder Basin region. Proposed hiking trails have been rerouted. Timber surveys now list the area as critical habitat for endangered species, technically true if not in the way my superiors imagine. Conservation easements have been expanded, creating a buffer zone around the creature's territory. On my patrols, I occasionally leave offerings at the edge of their domain, first aid supplies, preserved foods, metal tools that might be useful. They're always gone when I return, replaced sometimes with crafted items, intricately woven baskets, or stone tools of remarkable workmanship. A silent exchange between guardians. Late one evening, as I sat on my cabin porch watching the sunset paint the distant ridgelines, I heard it. 3 quick knocks, 2 slow, 3 quick, coming from the forest edge. Their warning call, but this time, it felt like a greeting. I responded with the pattern Jacob had taught me. 2 slow, 4 quick. Acknowledgement and respect. From the shadows between ancient trees, a large figure emerged briefly into the fading light. The Alpha, recognizable by its massive frame and distinctive bearing, it raised one hand in a gesture unmistakably meant as greeting, then melted back into the forest that had concealed its kind for centuries. That night, I added a new entry to my own ranger log, written in a code of my own devising. The traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples speaks of wild ones dwelling in remote forests. Science dismisses these accounts as folklore or misidentification of known wildlife. Both perspectives contain partial truths. There exists in the most remote corners of our wilderness a guardian species, intelligent, cultured, and far more aware of humanity than we are of them. They do not need our protection so much as we need theirs. In their continued existence lies hope that not all mysteries have been explained, not all wilderness tamed. I have seen them. I have been seen by them. And in that mutual recognition lies a responsibility older than the Forest Service, older than the nation that employs me. Some secrets belong to the wilderness itself. I close my journal and step outside into the night. Above me, stars wheel in patterns unchanged since before humans first entered these mountains. Below, in the valley, the lights of distant towns encroach ever closer to the wild places. Between those two realms, the eternal and the ephemeral, exist boundaries that must be maintained, territories that must be respected. That's what rangers do, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4, whether they speak with human tongues or voices made of wood knocks and whistles in the dark. In the distance, I hear their call again. Acknowledgement, warning, reminder. I am not alone in my vigil. I never was. The wilderness keeps its own. The Kaibab National Forest stretched before me like an endless sea of pines, their tops swaying gently against the Arizona sky. September 2024 marked my third solo expedition into these remote woodlands, nearly 40 miles from the nearest outpost of civilization. At 32, I'd grown weary of the digital noise and constant connectivity of my software development job in Phoenix. These solo expeditions had become necessary escapes, chances to reconnect with something more primal. "You heading up north again?" my colleague Michael had asked when I requested time off. "Better you than me, those woods get weird in the fall." I'd laughed it off. Michael was born and raised in Phoenix. Anything beyond streetlights made him uneasy, but his parting words lingered as I parked my Subaru at the trailhead. "My grandfather grew up near the Navajo Nation, said there are things in those woods that hunt differently than animals." The trail was unmarked, exactly as I preferred it. 6 days of solitude ahead. My backpack contained everything needed for survival: ultralight tent, dehydrated meals, water filtration system, first aid supplies, and my grandfather's hunting knife. The weight felt reassuring against my shoulders as I took my first steps into the wilderness. 3 hours of hiking brought me to my intended campsite, a small clearing near a creek that I'd marked on previous expeditions. The September air carried autumn's first chill, perfect hiking weather. As I set up camp, the forest hummed with familiar sounds: wind through pine needles, distant bird calls, the occasional rustle of small creatures. I collected firewood before sunset, piling branches near my tent. By nightfall, flames danced cheerfully, and I heated water for a meal of rehydrated beef stew. Stars emerged overhead, impossibly bright against the darkening sky. That first night passed uneventfully. I recorded the day's observations in my journal before zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The fire, reduced to embers outside, cast faint orange light against the tent walls. I woke at dawn to birdsong. After breakfast, I packed a day bag with essentials: water, protein bars, map, compass, knife, and first aid. Today's agenda included exploring the ridge 2 miles east where I'd spotted interesting rock formations on my last trip. The trail grew increasingly sparse as I ascended. By noon, I'd reached the ridge and paused to appreciate the panoramic view of endless forest. That's when I noticed it: a peculiar silence. The birds had stopped singing, wind moved through the trees, but no wildlife sounds accompanied it. I scanned the tree line below. Nothing unusual caught my eye, but a prickling sensation spread across my neck. The feeling of being observed. "Hello?" I called, feeling foolish immediately. No one else would be this far from marked trails. The silence held for another minute before the forest sounds gradually returned. I dismissed the moment as a passing hawk or other predator silencing the smaller creatures. Yet as I ate my lunch on that exposed ridge, the sensation of being watched returned intermittently. By late afternoon, I'd mapped the ridgeline and was heading back to camp when I discovered the first anomaly. My boot prints from earlier were interspersed with another set of tracks, human-sized but oddly shaped, longer in the toe, with unusual depth distribution suggesting an unnatural gait. I followed the tracks for 20 yards before they veered off into dense undergrowth. My rational mind provided explanations: another hiker, unusual boot design, maybe someone practicing primitive hunting techniques. Back at camp, everything appeared untouched, yet something felt subtly wrong. My firewood pile seemed rearranged. The tent stakes looked minutely adjusted. I chalked it up to paranoia born of isolation and set about preparing dinner. As darkness fell, the forest grew quiet again. Not the natural evening hush, but an absolute stillness that pressed against my ears. I stoked the fire higher than necessary, the flames crackling in defiance of the silence. That night I woke suddenly at 2:17 a.m. according to my watch. The fire had died to faint coals. Something had pulled me from deep sleep, a sound just beyond recognition. I lay perfectly still, listening. There it was again, a rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but too deliberate, too aware. It moved slowly around the perimeter of my camp, never approaching, never retreating, just circling. I clutched my knife beneath my sleeping bag, heart thundering in my chest. The breathing continued for 23 minutes by my watch before fading into the night. Sleep didn't return until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees. In the morning, I found no footprints, no signs of disturbance. But tied to a branch overlooking my campsite was a small bundle of twigs, bound with what appeared to be strands of coarse, dark hair. The twig bundle swayed slightly in the morning breeze. I approached it cautiously, examining without touching. The hairs binding it together were thick and coarse, not human, possibly horse or elk. The arrangement wasn't random. The twigs formed a rough geometric pattern I couldn't identify. Against my better judgment, I reached up and unhooked it from the branch. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, as though dense with purpose. I considered the possibilities: other hikers playing pranks, remains of an old indigenous marker, perhaps even wildlife researchers tagging territories. None felt convincing. I photographed it with my phone before slipping it into a Ziploc bag. Evidence of what? I wasn't sure. Part of me considered packing up immediately, but pride prevented retreat. One strange find wasn't reason enough to abandon my planned expedition. I spent that morning fishing at the creek, catching 2 decent-sized trout which I cleaned and cooked for lunch. The day passed without incident, though the sensation of being observed returned intermittently. Each time I would scan my surroundings, finding nothing but shadows and trees. By mid-afternoon, clouds gathered overhead, promising rain. I secured my campsite, stowing loose gear inside the tent and covering my firewood with a tarp. The first drops began falling as I finished, driving me into my tent with my journal and a book about local ecology. The rainfall intensified, drumming against the tent fabric. I dozed, lulled by the rhythmic sound. When I woke, the rain had stopped, but daylight had faded. According to my watch, I'd slept for nearly 3 hours. Emerging from the tent, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. My carefully stacked firewood was scattered. Not as though blown by wind, but deliberately dispersed in a rough circle. More disturbing were the prints in the mud around my campsite. The same elongated footprints I'd seen on the trail, but now they were everywhere. They approached from the north, circled my tent repeatedly, then retreated in the same direction. What struck me most was the timing. The rain had stopped approximately 30 minutes before I awoke, according to the dampness of the ground. The prints were crisp, undisturbed by the rainfall. Whatever had made them had been here while I slept, moving around my tent, standing mere inches from where I lay unconscious. I rebuilt my fire with trembling hands, the wood hissing as residual moisture met flame. Darkness fell completely, the forest becoming a wall of impenetrable black beyond my small circle of firelight. From my pack, I retrieved the small canister of bear spray I always carried. It wasn't much, but it provided some sense of security. I also laid my hunting knife on a flat rock near my camp chair, within easy reach. Dinner was a distracted affair, a protein bar and jerky, my appetite diminished by unease. I kept scanning the darkness, imagining shapes where there were none. The forest remained unnaturally quiet. At approximately 8:30 p.m., I heard the first call. It came from the north, a sound that began as something like a coyote's howl but shifted midway into something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like my name, drawn out and distorted. I convinced myself it was just the wind, or my mind playing tricks. Then it came again, closer this time. Undeniably a voice, yet wrong somehow, as though someone was learning to use vocal cords for the first time. "Who's there?" I called, standing and facing the direction of the sound. My voice sounded small against the vastness of the forest. No response came, but the sensation of being watched intensified to an almost physical pressure. I fed the fire higher, the flames temporarily pushing back the darkness. That's when I noticed my backpack. I'd left it leaning against a tree at the edge of my campsite. Now it stood upright in the center of the clearing, unzipped, my belongings neatly arranged in a line leading from the pack toward the darkest part of the forest. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't unpacked it. Heart racing, I quickly gathered my scattered possessions. My compass was missing, as was my map. More disturbing, the twigs and hair bundle I'd collected earlier was gone from its Ziploc bag, replaced with something else, a small pile of teeth. Not human, they appeared to be from various forest animals, but deliberately placed. I retreated to my tent, zipping myself inside, though I knew the thin nylon offered no actual protection. For hours I sat clutching my knife, listening to the sounds of the forest. Occasional branches cracked nearby. Twice I heard what sounded like breathing just outside the tent wall. When exhaustion finally overcame fear around 3 a.m., I fell into fitful sleep, plagued by dreams of being pursued through endless trees by something I couldn't quite see. I woke at first light to discover my tent surrounded by a perfect circle of small animal bones. The bone circle couldn't be rationalized away. Each bone, vertebrae, ribs, jawbones of small creatures was placed with deliberate precision, equidistant from its neighbors, forming a complete ring around my tent. No animal behavior explained this. This was messaging. I took photos with shaking hands before carefully stepping over the circle, irrationally fearful of disturbing it. The morning air felt thick with foreboding as I rekindled my fire and boiled water for coffee. Sleep deprivation left me jittery, jumping at every forest sound. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but disorientation and fear made rational planning difficult. My map and compass were gone. While I had GPS on my phone, battery conservation meant I used it sparingly, and the nearest trailhead was at least a day's hike away. As I deliberated, a voice called from the trees. "Hello? Anyone camping here?" I nearly dropped my coffee cup, fumbling for my knife before a figure emerged from the tree line, a man in his 60s with a weathered face and silver hair tucked under a Forest Service hat. The relief at seeing another human was overwhelming. "Morning," he said, approaching cautiously. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Ranger Monroe, doing wellness checks after yesterday's storm." His eyes tracked to the bone circle, narrowing slightly. "Did you arrange those?" he asked, voice carefully neutral. When I explained finding them this morning, his expression darkened. He surveyed the campsite, taking in the scattered firewood, my repositioned gear, and finally the bone circle. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "I'll escort you back to the ranger station." As I dismantled my campsite, Ranger Monroe maintained a vigilant watch on the surrounding forest. His hand rested near the service pistol on his hip. When I described the footprints and strange sounds, he nodded grimly but offered no explanation. We hiked in silence for the first hour, moving at a brisk pace that suggested urgency without panic. Only when we reached a small clearing did he pause, checking his radio before turning to me. "What you're describing has happened before," he said finally. "Not often, but enough that we know the pattern." He sat on a fallen log, gesturing for me to join him. "I've been a ranger here for 22 years, grew up in these parts. The official line is that these incidents are the work of transients or wildlife. Unofficially," he trailed off, scanning the trees. "The local tribes have stories about these forests, about entities that stalk and mimic. The Navajo call them skinwalkers, humans who've gained the ability to take animal form, or something in between. Their explanation for what you experienced." He must have seen the skepticism in my expression. "I'm not saying that's what it is," he continued. "But in my time here, I've encountered things I can't explain. Tracks that start and stop impossibly. Sounds that shouldn't exist. And yes, arrangements like your bone circle." "What do you think it is?" I asked. He sighed. "I think these woods are ancient, and we understand very little about them. What I know for certain is that when these signs appear, people who stay go missing." He described 3 disappearances in the past decade. Solitary hikers who reported strange occurrences similar to mine before vanishing. Searches found only abandoned campsites and, in one case, clothing scattered through the forest. "The pattern is always the same," he explained. "First comes the sensation of being watched, then tracks, small arrangements of natural items, escalating interference with belongings, then sounds, calls that mimic human voices. By that point, it's hunting." "Hunting?" The word hung in the air between us. Whatever it is, human, animal, or something else, it displays predatory behavior. It studies its prey, learns patterns, creates psychological distress before moving in. We resumed hiking, my mind racing with implications. The ranger's radio crackled occasionally with routine communications, the normalcy of it strangely comforting against our conversation. Near noon, we paused by a stream to refill water bottles. As I leaned down, something caught my eye, a reflection in the water that didn't match the tree line behind me. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing perfectly still among the pines. I whipped around but saw nothing there. "What is it?" Ranger Monroe asked, hand moving to his weapon. "I thought I saw something in the water. A reflection." His expression tightened. "We need to move faster." As we continued, the forest seemed to close in around us. Twice more I glimpsed movement at the periphery of my vision, a shadow keeping pace through the trees. The ranger saw it too. His stride became more urgent, his scanning more frequent. "It doesn't usually follow this far," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Around 3 p.m. we heard it, that same distorted call from last night, but now mimicking 2 voices in disturbing conversation. One sounded remarkably like my own, repeating fragments of things I'd said at my campsite. The other voice approximated the ranger's deeper tones. "Don't respond," Monroe warned. "It learns from interaction." The calls continued, growing closer despite our accelerated pace. The forest darkened prematurely as clouds gathered overhead. Another storm approaching. When we reached a steep ravine, the ranger hesitated. "The trail winds around this, adds 3 miles. We can descend and climb the other side, save time." The ravine looked treacherous. A steep slope leading to a rocky streambed, then an equally challenging climb up the opposite side. But the alternative meant more time in the forest with night approaching. As we carefully picked our way down, loose rocks skittering beneath our boots, I glanced back. There, at the edge of the ravine we'd just left, stood a figure. Too distant to make out clearly, but unmistakably watching us. It remained motionless as we hurried across the streambed and began our ascent of the opposite slope. Halfway up, Ranger Monroe slipped, crying out as his ankle twisted beneath him. He recovered quickly, but his face contorted with pain as he tested his weight. "I can make it," he insisted, though his limp was pronounced. When we reached the top and looked back, the figure was gone from the opposite ridge, but new tracks appeared in the soft earth before us. Those same elongated footprints, leading in the direction we needed to go. "It's gotten ahead of us," Monroe said quietly. "It knows where we're headed." The ranger station was still 4 miles away. Storm clouds darkened overhead, and somewhere in these woods, something was waiting. The first raindrops hit as we left the ravine behind, quickly intensifying to a steady downpour. Ranger Monroe's limp worsened with each step, though he insisted on maintaining our pace. The gathering darkness combined with rain reduced visibility to mere yards ahead. "There's an emergency shelter 2 miles from here," Monroe shouted over the rainfall. "We'll never make the station before nightfall in this weather." I offered my shoulder for support, and he reluctantly accepted. We moved awkwardly through the increasingly muddy trail, his breath coming in pained gasps whenever his injured ankle took weight. The rain created a constant symphony of sound. Water dripping from leaves, splashing into growing puddles, drumming against our rain gear. Within this wall of noise, other sounds became difficult to distinguish. Twice I was certain I heard footsteps pacing us just off the trail, but the dense curtain of rain revealed nothing when I turned to look. Monroe noticed my constant scanning. "It's still with us," he confirmed, no question in his voice. "What does it want?" I asked, immediately feeling foolish. What predator wants anything beyond the satisfaction of a successful hunt? "Territory, maybe," he replied unexpectedly. "Or it's protecting something. The pattern intensifies in certain areas, always in autumn, like it's seasonal." Lightning flashed overhead, briefly illuminating the forest around us. In that instant of harsh white light, I saw it. A figure standing motionless among the trees 30 yards back. The glimpse lasted less than a second, but the image burned into my retinas. Unnaturally tall and thin, standing perfectly still despite the raging storm, head tilted at an odd angle. Monroe saw my expression. "Keep moving," he urged. "Don't acknowledge it." The trail narrowed as we entered denser forest, pine branches hanging low across our path. The rain lessened slightly under this natural canopy, but darkness deepened proportionally. Monroe retrieved a flashlight from his belt, the beam cutting weakly through the gloom. "Half a mile to the shelter," he said, checking his GPS. "We can secure it for the night, continue at first light." The promise of shelter propelled us forward, despite exhaustion and Monroe's increasingly labored breathing. The rain tapered to a light drizzle as we pushed through the final stretch of trail. The emergency shelter appeared suddenly, a small, sturdy cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping. Solar-powered emergency lights glowed faintly around the entrance. Monroe produced a key ring, fumbling with cold fingers before finding the right one. "Get inside," he instructed, holding the door. I hesitated, scanning the forest behind us one last time. Nothing visible moved in the gathering darkness, but the sensation of being watched had intensified to an almost physical pressure between my shoulder blades. The cabin interior was Spartan but secure. A single room with 4 bunks, a wood stove, emergency supplies, and crucially, sturdy locks on the door and shuttered windows. Monroe immediately set about securing the entrance while I examined the wood stove. "There's dry wood," I confirmed, opening the metal box beside it. "Get a fire going," he nodded, testing the door locks repeatedly. Temperatures dropping fast, soon the wood stove cast welcome heat and light across the small space. Monroe lowered himself onto a bunk, finally examining his injured ankle. The swelling was visible even through his boot. "Sprain, not a break," he concluded, carefully removing the boot and wrapping the ankle with an ace bandage from his pack. "I've had worse." I distributed emergency rations from the cabin's supplies, protein bars, beef jerky, packets of trail mix. We ate in relative silence, the events of the day settling heavily between us. "Will it try to get in?" I finally asked, the question that had been foremost in my mind since entering the shelter. Monroe considered this, eyes fixed on the door. "In 22 years, I've never known one to breach a structure. They seem to prefer open spaces. The psychological element of the hunt, his use of they rather than it, sent a fresh chill through me. There's more than one? No reports of multiple encounters simultaneously, he clarified. But distinct patterns over the years suggest different individuals. Outside, the wind had risen, branches scraping against the cabin roof. The ordinary sounds of a forest night, yet each registered as potential threat. Monroe checked his radio again, frowning at the lack of signal. "Storm's interfering," he muttered. "We'll try again in the morning." We established a watch rotation, one sleeping while the other remained alert. Monroe took first watch despite his injury, insisting I needed rest more after my sleepless previous night. I lay on the lower bunk, exhaustion washing over me, yet sleep remained elusive. Every sound from outside, every creak of timber, every rustle of leaves, sent adrenaline coursing through my system. I must have eventually dozed because Monroe's hand on my shoulder startled me awake. "Your watch," he whispered. "It's just past midnight." I sat up, disoriented momentarily. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting the cabin in dim orange light. Monroe settled onto the opposite bunk with a pained sigh. "Anything?" I asked. "Just the storm," he replied, though something in his tone suggested uncertainty. I added wood to the stove, then positioned myself near the single window, drawing back the shutter incrementally to peer outside. The storm had passed, leaving a clear, star-filled sky. Moonlight illuminated the clearing around the cabin in silvery half-light. For an hour, nothing moved in my field of vision. The forest stood silent, as though holding its breath. I began to wonder if our pursuer had finally lost interest. Then, at approximately 1:30 a.m., I noticed movement at the forest edge. Something emerged from the trees with deliberate slowness, a figure that moved with an awkward, jerking gait. In the moonlight, its proportions seemed wrong somehow. Limbs too long, torso too narrow. It stopped at the tree line, face turned toward the cabin. Though 50 yards separated us, I had the distinct impression it was looking directly at me through the small gap in the shutters. For several minutes it remained motionless. Then, with sudden violence, it dropped to all fours and began circling the clearing with unnatural speed, moving in a wide arc around the cabin. Its gait was wrong, not like a human on hands and knees, nor like any animal I recognized. I wanted to wake Monroe, but found myself frozen, unable to look away as it completed 3 full circuits of the clearing. After the third rotation, it stopped directly before the cabin, still on all fours, head tilted up toward our window. It rose slowly to its full height, taller than any man I'd ever seen. In the moonlight, details remained mercifully obscured, but its silhouette suggested wrongness. Joints that bent in impossible directions, a head that sat awkwardly upon 2 narrow shoulders. I held my breath, certain it could somehow sense my presence behind the shutters. For what seemed an eternity, it stood motionless, facing the cabin. Then it spoke, a raspy approximation of Ranger Monroe's voice. "Get inside." Temperatures dropping fast. The words he'd spoken to me hours earlier, repeated with perfect intonation but wrong somehow, as though forced through vocal cords not designed for human speech. It stepped closer to the cabin. 5 yards away now, close enough that moonlight revealed more details. Clothing that hung in tatters, limbs that seemed jointed in too many places. A face that remained mercifully shadowed. "Will it try to get in?" My own voice now, perfectly mimicked, floating through the night air. I fumbled for the shutter, closing it with trembling hands, then backed away from the window. Monroe stirred on his bunk, roused by the sound. "What is it?" he asked, instantly alert. "It's outside," I whispered. It spoke, using our voices. Monroe rose, grimacing as he put weight on his injured ankle. He retrieved his service pistol from its holster, checking the magazine before moving to the door and testing the locks again. "It's never been this aggressive," he murmured. "Something's different." A sudden impact against the cabin wall made us both jump, a heavy thud followed by slow scraping sounds. Something was moving around the perimeter, testing the structure. Another impact, harder this time, rattling the shutters. Then silence. For 15 minutes we stood motionless, straining to hear any sound from outside. Monroe positioned himself between me and the door, pistol ready. The knock, when it came, was almost civilized. 3 precise taps on the wooden door. Then a voice. This time an unsettling blend of both our voices merged together. In 22 years, I've never known one to breach a structure. Monroe's face went ashen. He raised his pistol, aiming at the door. Another voice spoke then. Neither mine nor Monroe's, but something older, deeper. carrying an accent I couldn't place. Until now, the handle of the cabin door began to turn, rotating slowly despite the deadbolt securing it. Metal groaned as pressure increased against the lock mechanism. Monroe stepped forward, pistol trained on the door, his injured leg nearly buckling beneath him. "Back corner," he ordered, motioning me toward the farthest point from the entrance. The handle stopped turning. Silence descended once more, heavy and expectant. Then came a new sound, scratching along the cabin's wooden exterior, methodical and deliberate. It circled the entire structure, pausing at each window before moving to the next. At the rear window, the scratching lingered. The shutter vibrated slightly, as though something were testing its strength. Wood splintered, a small but distinct crack. Monroe pivoted, aiming at the sound. "It's trying to find a way in," he whispered. The scratching stopped abruptly. Seconds stretched into minutes of complete silence. Had it departed? The oppressive sensation of being watched suggested otherwise. A sudden crash from the roof shattered the quiet, heavy footsteps moving across wooden shingles. Dust and debris sifted down from the ceiling as something substantial traversed the length of the cabin. The footsteps stopped directly above the wood stove chimney. Monroe's eyes tracked upward. "The flue," he muttered, before either of us could react. A piercing shriek emanated from the chimney, not a human scream but something primal that raised every hair on my body. The sound echoed in the small space, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. The wood stove door flew open, embers scattering across the floor. Monroe fired a single shot into the chimney, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The shrieking stopped, replaced by frantic movement on the roof. "Put out those embers," Monroe shouted, limping toward the door as I stomped out the glowing coals, threatening to ignite the wooden floor. More impacts struck the roof, then the walls, not organized now but frenzied, as though our resistance had triggered rage. A window shutter splintered, moonlight streaming through newly formed cracks. "It's testing every entry point," Monroe said grimly, reloading his weapon. "We need to be ready if it breaches." The attack continued for nearly 20 minutes, a systematic assault on every potential vulnerability. Throughout, that same scratching sound continued, like claws or tools working at the wood. Then, as suddenly as it began, the assault ceased. The abrupt silence felt almost more threatening than the previous violence. Minutes passed. Monroe maintained his vigilant stance, weapon trained on the door, while I watched the damaged window shutter. Neither of us spoke, afraid to break the fragile quiet. A scraping sound came from outside, something being dragged across the clearing. It continued for several minutes before stopping directly in front of the cabin. "Look," Monroe whispered, gesturing toward the damaged shutter. Through the cracks, a new sight greeted us. A precise arrangement of branches and stones on the ground before the cabin, illuminated by moonlight. Not random debris, but a clear symbol, a complex geometric pattern I recognized from my anthropology courses, a Native American protection symbol, specifically Navajo in origin. "Why would it—" I began, but Monroe silenced me with a gesture. Movement at the forest edge drew our attention. The figure emerged once more into the moonlight, but its posture had changed, no longer predatory, but almost ceremonial. It raised one elongated arm, pointing directly at the symbol it had created, then at us. "What's it doing?" I whispered. "I don't know," Monroe admitted. "In all my years, I've never seen this behavior." The figure remained motionless for several minutes, arm extended toward us. Then it spoke again, this time in a voice that sounded ancient, words in a language I didn't recognize but Monroe apparently did. His expression shifted from fear to confusion. "It's Navajo," he said quietly. "My grandmother was part Navajo. It's saying, it's warning us. Warning us about what? Not about, for. It's warning us to leave. Tomorrow. First light." He frowned, struggling with the translation. "Something about others coming. Territory." The figure lowered its arm, then performed what appeared to be a ritual movement, a complex series of gestures directed at the symbol on the ground. When it finished, it retreated several steps, maintaining its face toward the cabin. "It's establishing a boundary," Monroe said, voice tinged with disbelief. "The symbol, it's a territorial marker, a temporary truce." As if confirming his interpretation, the figure backed away until it reached the tree line. There it paused, performing another series of gestures before melting into the darkness of the forest. We maintained our vigilance through the remainder of the night, but no further disturbances occurred. The symbol remained visible in the moonlight, a bizarre guarantee of temporary safety. As first light approached, Monroe attempted his radio again, finally establishing contact with the ranger station. He requested immediate evacuation, citing a medical emergency rather than explaining the true circumstances. They wouldn't believe us anyway, he explained, securing his equipment. Better they think I just injured myself badly. What was it? I asked as we prepared to depart. The question that had burned in my mind throughout the ordeal. Monroe checked the grounds through the damaged shutter before responding. The tribes have their explanations, science has others. What matters is understanding the rules of engagement. He unlocked the door cautiously, surveying the clearing before stepping outside. The symbol remained intact on the ground, exactly as it had been placed during the night. Don't disturb that, he warned as I moved past it. The forest appeared peaceful in the morning light. Birds singing, dew glistening on leaves, no sign of our nocturnal visitor. Yet the sensation of being watched persisted as we made our way toward the main trail where evacuation would meet us. Will you report what really happened? I asked as we walked. Monroe's expression hardened. 3 hikers missing in 10 years. Dozens of reports of strange encounters. I've filed every one, included every detail. They sit in filing cabinets, labeled unsubstantiated. He gestured at the forest around us. These lands were sacred to the indigenous people long before they became recreation areas. They understood something we've forgotten. That wilderness isn't just trees and rocks, but a living system with its own imperatives. You believe it's supernatural? I pressed. I believe categorizing it misses the point, he replied. Natural, supernatural, these are our impositions. What matters is that it exists, it has purpose, and it responds to encroachment. We reached the designated evacuation point 30 minutes ahead of schedule. Monroe lowered himself onto a fallen log, checking his swollen ankle. The forest remained quiet around us. The sensation of being observed now faded to almost nothing. Will it come after us again? I asked, scanning the tree line. We're leaving its territory as instructed, he replied. The encounter is over, for now. For now? Monroe met my gaze directly. These forests have cycles, patterns. What we experienced intensifies in autumn, then subsides. Traditional knowledge suggests they're protecting breeding grounds or performing seasonal migrations. You think there are more? Reports come from across the Southwest. Similar encounters, similar patterns, but distinct signatures, different territories, different individuals. In the distance, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the morning quiet. Our evacuation arriving. One last thing, Monroe said, voice low. What you experienced. The bone circle, the mimicry, the symbol. These aren't random, they're communication. The forest speaks a language we've forgotten how to hear. As the Forest Service vehicle appeared on the trail ahead, Monroe added, some secrets belong to the wilderness. Best to respect their keeping. The rescue team loaded Monroe into the vehicle, his official report citing a badly sprained ankle from the storm. I joined them, casting one final glance at the forest that had almost become my grave. For an instant, I thought I glimpsed movement among the distant trees, a tall figure observing our departure. But when I blinked, there was nothing there but swaying branches in the morning breeze. 3 weeks after returning from the Kaibab, I still wake nightly at 2:17 a.m., the precise time I first heard the breathing around my tent. My apartment in Phoenix feels simultaneously too confined and too exposed. I've installed new locks, security cameras, motion sensors, rational precautions against irrational fears. The official report bears no resemblance to what actually occurred. Ranger Monroe's injury is attributed to a fall during routine patrol. My participation appears as a footnote. Civilian hiker assisted to safety during storm. No mention of bone circles, mimicked voices, or territorial symbols. I've spent countless hours researching since my return. Folklore, anthropological studies, unexplained disappearances in national forests. The patterns Monroe mentioned emerge across decades of documentation, encounters intensifying in autumn, concentrated in certain geographic regions, following similar progressions from observation to interaction. The Navajo skinwalker legend provides one framework of understanding. Humans who, through forbidden rituals, gain the ability to transform and hunt in animal form, but similar entities appear in indigenous traditions worldwide. The Wendigo of Algonquian peoples, the Nalusa Falaya of Choctaw lore, the Kushtaka of the Tlingit, different names for territorial guardians that move between human and animal existence. Science offers alternative explanations, undocumented predator species, psychological effects of isolation, shared cultural hallucinations. none fully account for what I experienced. 2 days ago, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address, postmarked from Fredonia, the nearest town to Kaibab National Forest. Inside, my missing compass and map, along with a page torn from what appeared to be an old journal. The handwriting was faded, dated October 1958, third encounter near North Ridge. Subject displayed increased territorial marking. Attempted communication through arranged objects. Pattern suggests seasonal defense rather than predation. Recommendation restricted access September through November. At the bottom, a more recent addition in different handwriting. The pattern continues. Respect the boundaries. I recognized Ranger Monroe's handwriting from his incident report. Yesterday, I called the Kaibab Ranger Station asking to speak with Monroe. The dispatcher informed me he'd taken early retirement 3 days after our evacuation, citing his injury and personal reasons. His forwarding information was confidential. This morning, local news reported a hiker missing in the Kaibab National Forest. A solo backpacker last seen entering an unmarked trail 5 miles from where my encounter began. The search is concentrated in the wrong areas. I know this with certainty. I've debated contacting authorities with what I know. The rational part of my mind insists on scientific explanation. A human predator with elaborate psychological tactics. A territorial animal with unusual intelligence. The part of me that spent that night in the cabin knows better. What haunts me most isn't the entity itself, but the communication attempt, the warning. Not a random predator, but a guardian enforcing ancient boundaries with established protocols. We were released because we understood and complied. Others might not be so fortunate. My phone contains dozens of photos from that expedition. The bone circle, the footprints, the symbol left before the cabin. Evidence, though, of what exactly I'm still uncertain. Last night, reviewing these images for the 100th time, I noticed something I'd previously missed. In the background of a photo taken at my first campsite, barely visible among distant trees, a tall, slender figure watching. It had been there from the beginning, assessing, evaluating. I've booked a flight to Flagstaff tomorrow. From there, I'll drive to the ranger station and join the search efforts. Not because I believe we'll find the missing hiker alive, but because someone needs to redirect the search to the proper location. Someone who understands what they're truly looking for. The warning wasn't just for Monroe and me. It was meant to be carried back, shared. The boundaries are changing, territories expanding. The seasonal movements Monroe described are shifting, perhaps in response to climate changes, human encroachment, or factors we don't yet understand. As I pack my bag for tomorrow's flight, I place my grandfather's hunting knife on top. Not because I believe it would protect me if encounters occurred again, but as acknowledgement of a deeper truth. We enter the wilderness not as conquerors, but as guests in territories older than human memory. The forests have guardians. They speak languages of arranged bones, mimicked voices, and symbols drawn in earth. They enforce boundaries established long before our national parks and hiking trails imposed artificial order on ancient domains. I don't know if what stalked me through the Kaibab was human, animal, or something that moves between these states of being. What I know with certainty is that it was sentinel to knowledge we've forgotten, that wilderness contains secrets meant to remain hidden and territories where we are, at best, tolerated visitors. Tomorrow I return to the forest, not to hunt the hunter, but to remind others of boundaries we cross at our peril. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. Some knowledge once gained cannot be unlearned. The wilderness is watching. It has always been watching. And sometimes when the ancient boundaries are crossed, it does more than watch. It hunts.